Hey everyone, and welcome back to Conspiracy Theory Declassified. Tonight, we re-peeling back the layers on a story that feels like it's ripped from a political thriller, but is chillingly, terrifyingly real. We're going deep into the government's own archives to look at a declassified plot, born in the highest echelons of the U.S. military, to stage violent attacks on American soil against American citizens, all to create a pretext for a war. What happens when the guardians of a nation are willing to sacrifice their own people for a political goal? Before we dive into the mystery, if you're as fascinated by the unknown as I am, please hit that like and subscribe button. It helps us find more stories that deserve to be told. And we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below with a mystery you think is due for a new look. All right, turn down the lights, get comfortable, and let's begin our investigation. You find yourself in a place removed from the noise of the world. It's a quiet, climate-controlled room, the kind where history is preserved under the strictest of conditions. You can smell the faint, dry scent of old paper and archival glue. The only sound is the low, almost imperceptible hum of the ventilation system, a constant, sterile whisper. Before you, on a polished wooden table, sits a document. It's not ancient, not a crumbling scroll from a forgotten time. It's from an era you can almost touch, the age of sharpsuits, Cold War paranoia, and the looming shadow of the atomic bomb. The paper is thick, a little yellowed at the edges. At the top, stamped in bold, stark red ink, are the words that send a small, cold current through you. Top secret. Eyes only. Eyes. Your eyes scan the cover page. The title is deceptively mundane. Justification for U.S. military intervention in Cuba. Below it, a date, March 13th, 1962. This isn't just a memo, it's a relic from a moment of crisis, a powder keg waiting for a spark. You carefully turn the page, your mind bracing for the dry, bureaucratic language of military planning. But what you find is something else entirely. It's a blueprint, a detailed, step-by-step guide for a campaign of deception and violence aimed not at a foreign enemy, but at the hearts and minds of the American people. The name of this proposal, buried in the text, is Operation Northwoods. This document is the central, undeniable fact of our story tonight. It is not a theory, not a rumor whispered on the internet. You can look it up yourself, held in the National Archives. It was drafted and signed by every single member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking uniformed officers in the entire United States Armed Forces. It was formally submitted by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Lyman L. Lemnitzer, to the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. Its objective was simple and monstrous: to create a series of false pretexts or false flag attacks that would provoke widespread public outrage and provide the undeniable justification for a full-scale military invasion of Fidel Castro's Cuba. As you read further, the clinical, detached language makes the proposals even more horrifying. The document suggests a brief and convincing series of provocations. It speaks of creating incidents that would place the United States in the position of suffering justifiable grievances. You see, they knew that the American public, and indeed the world, would not support an unprovoked war. So the architects of Operation Northwoods decided they would need to manufacture the provocation themselves. They would need to create martyrs. They would need American blood to be spilled, and they would need a clear villain to blame. You scan a list of proposals, each one more audacious and terrifying than the last. They talk about starting a Remember the Maine incident by blowing up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blaming Cuba. They detail plans to develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington. This wasn't just a vague idea, they laid it out. They proposed staging bombings, sinking boatloads of Cuban refugees on the high seas, and even orchestrating violent clashes with fake Cuban agents on the streets of American cities. They would plant evidence, fabricate intelligence, and feed it all to a trusting press and a frightened public. And here you stumble upon a lesser-known, chillingly specific detail that highlights the sheer cold-bloodedness of the plan. It wasn't enough to just report on these fake attacks. The document explicitly suggests creating casualty lists in U.S. newspapers to cause a healthy wave of national indignation. You pause and let that sink in. The highest leaders of the U.S. military were not just willing to contemplate the deaths of American civilians, they were actively planning how to best leverage those deaths for maximum emotional impact. They were strategizing the marketing of tragedy, storyboarding a war using the currency of American lives. It's a level of calculated cynicism that is difficult to comprehend. The plan was to write a script where Americans were the victims, Cuba was the villain, and the U.S. military was the hero rushing in to save the day. And the men who wrote it were prepared to build the stage, dress the actors, and fire the live rounds to make it all believable. The hum of the archive room seems to grow louder in the silence. The weight of this declassified truth feels heavy in the air around you. It's a stark reminder that the conspiracies we fear are sometimes dwarfed by the plans that were once stamped top secret. This document, in all its horrific detail, forces you to confront a fundamental and deeply unsettling question. If this is a plan that was authored, signed, and seriously proposed at the highest level of the military, a plan we only know about because of declassification decades later, what other plans remain buried? What other operations, perhaps even more disturbing, are still sealed away in a vault hidden under that same stark red stamp? Top secret. Eyes only? That question hangs heavy in the sterile air of the archive. To even begin to understand how such a document could be conceived, let alone formally proposed, you have to leave the silence of that room. You must push the document aside for a moment and step back in time, immersing yourself in the crackling electric paranoia of the early 1960s. You find yourself in a world painted in stark contrasts, the bright, optimistic promise of a new decade, set against the deep, existential dread of the Cold War. You can almost feel the static in the air, see the flicker of black and white television sets in every living room, broadcasting grainy images of mushroom clouds and stern-faced Soviet premiers. This is a time when the enemy isn't just a foreign army, it's an ideology, a creeping red tide called communism that seems poised to swallow the world. You hear it in the rhetoric of politicians, you see it in newspaper headlines, and you feel it in the fabric of daily life. School children are practicing duck and cover drills, hiding under their flimsy wooden desks as if that could offer any protection from nuclear annihilation. Families are building fallout shelters in their backyards, stocking them with canned goods and Geiger counters. The threat isn't distant or abstract, it feels immediate, personal, and terrifyingly close. The Soviet Union is the great menacing bear on the other side of the world, a rival superpower with thousands of nuclear warheads aimed directly at you. Every international incident, every political shift, is viewed through this lens of a global, zero-sum game of chess between two titans. And on this grand chessboard, a new piece has suddenly appeared. A piece that has changed the entire geometry of the game. Just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, the island of Cuba has fallen. In 1959, Fidel Castro's revolution succeeded, and by 1961, he had openly declared it a socialist state, aligning himself with Moscow. Suddenly, the enemy isn't thousands of miles away across an ocean. It's a stone's throw from American shores. A Soviet-aligned communist outpost is now sitting on the doorstep of the United States. For the military and intelligence communities in Washington, this is more than a political setback. It's an intolerable strategic threat, a dagger pointed at the throat of America. This brings you to a well-established and deeply significant historical fact that serves as the immediate backdrop for Operation Northwoods, the Bay of Pigs invasion. In April of 1961, less than a year before the Northwoods memo was written, the CIA executed a plan, approved by the young and newly inaugurated President John F. Kennedy, to land a force of Cuban exiles on the island to spark a popular uprising and overthrow Castro. The failure at the Bay of Pigs didn't just embarrass the Kennedy administration, it created a festering obsession within the Pentagon and the CIA. They had tried and failed. Castro had won the first round, and the desire for retribution, for a decisive victory, grew into a fever pitch. The military brass felt their hands had been tied. That political hesitation had doomed a workable plan. They were determined not to let that happen again. This burning desire to eliminate Castro brings us to a lesser-known, but critically important, piece of context. In the wake of the Bay of Pigs fiasco, the Kennedy administration secretly initiated a massive, multifaceted covert war against Cuba. This wasn't just a handful of spies. It was a full-blown campaign of sabotage, propaganda, and assassination plots known as Operation Mongoose. To oversee the secret war, an elite high-level committee was formed called the Special Group, Augmented. And who was placed in charge of this group, driving its aggressive anti-Castro agenda? The president's own brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. This reveals a crucial truth. The pressure to get Castro wasn't just coming from hawkish generals. It was a central driving obsession of the Kennedy administration itself. RFK reportedly told aides that getting rid of Castro was the top priority of the United States government. All else is secondary. This created an environment, a pressure cooker in Washington, where any and all options for dealing with Cuba were on the table. The generals who conceived of Northwoods weren't acting in a vacuum. They were responding in their own extreme way to an urgent and relentless demand for a solution that emanated from the very top of the government. You are now standing in the heart of this storm. The air is thick with failure, fear, and a desperate hunger for a win. The humiliation of the Bay of Pigs is a fresh wound. The specter of nuclear war is a daily reality, and the president and his brother are demanding results in the secret war against the small island nation that has dared to defy American power. It's in this crucible of paranoia and frustration that the unthinkable starts to seem plausible. It's here that men in decorated uniforms begin to believe that the only way to convince the American people to go to war is to lie to them, to trick them to make them victims of a phantom menace so that they will rise up and demand the very conflict the Pentagon desires. This context doesn't excuse the plan, but it helps you understand the poisoned soil from which it grew. It forces you to ask a difficult question that resonates far beyond the 1960s. When a nation becomes consumed by fear, how quickly does its moral compass begin to spin? And in that environment of absolute conviction and terror, how easily can the line be crossed between protecting your citizens and using them as pawns in a much larger game? To understand that perilous moral line, you have to understand the men who were willing not just to approach it, but to draw it themselves in thick, bold ink. You must look past the abstract forces of history and politics and focus on the architect of the document now resting in your mind, S.I. His signature is there on the cover page, confident and clear. L.L. Lemnitzer, General Lyman Lewis Lemnitzer. You see him now, not as just a name, but as a figure of immense authority in the spring of 1962. Picture a man in his early 60s, his face set in the stern, unyielding expression of a career soldier. His uniform is immaculate, the shoulders weighed down with the 4 stars of a full general. The chest, a constellation of ribbons and medals earned on battlefields and in planning rooms across the globe. When he walks into a room, there is no question who is in command. This is not just a general. He is the general, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the single highest-ranking military officer in all of the United States Armed Forces. His voice, you imagine, is a low, gravelly baritone, accustomed to giving orders and having them followed without question. He is the professional head of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines. He is the principal military advisor to the President of the United States. The man who signed off on a plan to murder American citizens was not some fringe radical or a shadowy operative from a spy novel. He was the absolute pinnacle of the American military establishment. And that is a well-established, profoundly disturbing fact. His entire life was a testament to the structure and discipline of the military. A 1920 graduate of West Point, he rose through the ranks with a reputation as a brilliant planner and a steady hand. During World War II, he was a key staff officer for General Eisenhower, helping to plan the Allied invasions of North Africa and Sicily. He personally negotiated the secret surrender of Italy. After the war, his ascent continued. Command of the 7th Infantry Division in the brutal final year of the Korean War, Commander-in-Chief of U.S. forces in the Far East, and then, before his appointment as chairman, the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, overseeing all of the alliance's forces in Europe. Lyman Lemnitzer was, by every traditional measure, a celebrated American hero. But he was also a product of his time, a dyed-in-the-wool Cold Warrior. He viewed the world as a brutal, unforgiving struggle between American freedom and the monolithic evil of Soviet communism. In this struggle, he believed, there was no room for hesitation, diplomacy, or political nuance. These were, to him, the tools of weak-willed politicians. The only language the communists understood was the overwhelming application of military force. You can sense his frustration with the new administration. President Kennedy and his team of whiz kids, like Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, were intellectuals. They spoke of flexible response, counterinsurgency, and covert action. To a man like Lemnitzer, who had commanded vast armies, this was dangerously naive. He saw the Bay of Pigs not just as a failure of execution, but as a failure of will. And in Cuba, he saw an existential threat that the politicians were too timid to eliminate. This conviction, this belief in the primacy of military action, leads you to a lesser-known and deeply chilling aspect of Lemnitzer's strategic thinking. It goes far beyond Cuba and reveals a mindset comfortable with apocalyptic gambles. Throughout the late 1950s and into his tenure as chairman, General Lemnitzer was a staunch advocate for a preemptive, all-out nuclear strike against the Soviet Union. He was a key proponent of strategic plans that called for launching the entire American nuclear arsenal, thousands of warheads, at the first sign of a potential Soviet attack, or even just during a period of heightened tension. He believed that the only survivable path through a nuclear conflict was to strike first, without warning, and with such devastating force that the enemy would be unable to retaliate. You must pause and grasp the enormity of this. The man who would later sign the Northwoods memo was, just months earlier, arguing for the authority to initiate a global thermonuclear war that would have resulted in the deaths of hundreds of millions of people. Suddenly, Operation Northwoods doesn't seem like an aberration. It feels like a logical extension of the same cold, brutal calculus. If you are willing to contemplate the incineration of half the planet to gain a strategic advantage over your primary enemy, then how much of a leap is it really to sacrifice a few hundred of your own citizens to justify removing a lesser but still intolerable threat 90 miles from your coast? From this perspective, Northwoods was a military solution for a political problem. The American people and their civilian leaders lacked the will to do what was necessary. Therefore, it was the military's duty to create a situation so shocking, so infuriating, that the will of the people would align with the strategic objectives of the Pentagon. It was Lemnitzer, the master planner, applying the ruthless logic of the battlefield to the American homeland itself. You look again at that signature on the document. It's no longer just a name. It's the embodiment of a worldview, a dangerous intersection of duty, paranoia, and absolute certainty. It represents a mindset where the ends, the destruction of communism, justified almost any means. This forces you to consider a question that strikes at the very heart of the relationship between a nation and its protectors. What happens when the tools of a soldier, deception, strategic sacrifice, and the relentless pursuit of victory, are turned inward and applied not to a foreign enemy on a battlefield, but to the very public they are sworn to defend? And what safeguards exist to stop the guardians of a nation from seeing its own citizens as obstacles to be managed, or worse, as assets to be expended for the greater good? The most terrifying answer to that question lies waiting for you, typed neatly on the pages of the very document he signed. You turn your attention from the stern face of the general back to the memorandum he endorsed, feeling its conceptual weight. It is here, in the cold, passionless text of Operation Northwoods, that the military mindset is laid bare. You are now looking closely at the words themselves, and what strikes you is not a tone of manic conspiratorial rage. There is no hint of fanaticism in the prose. Instead, what you find is far more chilling, the calm, methodical language of bureaucracy. The entire document reads like a business proposal, a project plan drafted by a committee of mid-level managers. It is filled with acronyms, bullet points, and numbered annexes. It speaks of pretexts, incidents, and objectives. It talks about harnessing a wave of national indignation, as if it were a natural resource to be exploited. The proposals to commit murder and acts of terrorism are presented with the same emotional detachment you would use to describe the logistics of moving office furniture. This, you realize, is the true horror of Operation Northwoods. The evil it contains is not hot-blooded. It is cold, clinical, and administrative. It's a blueprint for atrocity drafted on a government letterhead, proofread for typos, and submitted through the proper channels. This is the document's most undeniable fact. The list of specific, shocking proposals it contains, presented as a menu of options for the Secretary of Defense. You read through the main points, and each one lands like a physical blow. The first major proposal is titled Remember the Maine. The memo states, quote, "We could blow up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba." It goes on to suggest that casualty lists could be published and that the funerals for the victims would provide a powerful emotional catalyst for war. It is a direct and shameless evocation of the 1898 incident that propelled the United States into the Spanish-American War, an event many historians now believe was itself a false flag or an accident, not a Spanish attack. The Joint Chiefs weren't just planning an attack. They were consciously trying to replicate a historically successful pretext for war. You read on. The next proposal is to develop a communist Cuban terror campaign. The memo coolly suggests this could be staged in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, or even in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. It talks of planting bombs in public places, blaming the attacks on irresponsible Cuban elements. It even suggests a particularly ghastly scenario. We could sink a boatload of Cubans en route to Florida, real or simulated. The document notes that they could stage an incident where Cuban aircraft or ships attack a vessel carrying refugees, creating a horrific humanitarian crisis that would demand U.S. intervention. The parenthetical, real or simulated, is breathtaking in its cynicism. The lives of those fleeing Castro's regime were considered expendable, their deaths a potential tool for propaganda. The specificity is relentless. They suggest creating evidence that would tie Castro to the attacks, such as a non-existent Cuban agent as pocket litter, or documents that would prove Cuban involvement. They would orchestrate arrests of fake Cuban agents and extract confessions. It was to be a fully scripted and produced piece of theater, with the American public as the unsuspecting audience. As you dig deeper into the appendices, you uncover a lesser-known but incredibly detailed scheme that reveals the operational level of their planning. This wasn't just brainstorming. They had worked out the logistics. The plan was to create an incident involving a civilian airliner. They proposed chartering a plane, filling it with a carefully selected group of college students, and having them fly to a destination in South America. At a certain point in the flight, the passenger list would be publicized. The actual plane with the students would land at a secure U.S. airbase like Eglin, and a remote-controlled drone, an identical duplicate of the airliner, would take its place on the flight plan. This drone would then broadcast a Mayday message, stating it was under attack by Cuban MiG fighters. Then the drone would be destroyed by a pre-planned explosion, sending fake wreckage plummeting into the ocean. The world would believe that a plane full of American college students had just been shot down in cold blood by the Cuban Air Force. The wave of indignation, the memo writers were sure, would be unstoppable. This wasn't a vague suggestion. They had considered the details, from swapping the planes to creating a fake passenger manifest to ensuring the drone could be remotely detonated. They were prepared to deceive the families of these students, the media, and the entire world. It's a plot so elaborate and diabolical that it feels like fiction, yet you are reading it in a declassified government document, signed by the highest military authority in the land. The Northwoods memo is a catalog of calculated treachery. Each proposal is a self-contained universe of deception, designed to manipulate the emotions of an entire country. And it is all presented in this sterile, procedural language, as if the authors felt no moral weight, no human consequence to the plans they were drafting. This stark contrast between the banality of the language and the monstrosity of the ideas it conveys forces a profound question to the surface. When horrific concepts like false flag terrorism are sanitized by spreadsheets, acronyms, and the detached vocabulary of bureaucracy, does it make them more palatable for otherwise rational people to consider and approve? Does the very act of reducing human tragedy to a bullet point on a project plan become the most insidious and dangerous form of evil imaginable? That unsettling question about how bureaucracy can act as a solvent for morality finds its starkest and most historically resonant example in the very first major pretext offered in the Northwoods memo. You focus your attention on this initial proposal, a plan wrapped in the faded glories of a past war, a deliberate and cynical echo designed to play on the deepest chords of American patriotism and outrage. The planners in the Pentagon gave it a title, a piece of shorthand that was both a historical reference and a set of instructions. Remember the Maine. To understand the sheer audacity of this proposal, you must first transport yourself to the place it was meant to happen. You are standing on the hot, sun-baked pier of the U.S. Naval Base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, in 1962. You can feel the oppressive Caribbean humidity, taste the salt in the air. On one side of you is the familiar sight of a U.S. Navy destroyer, gray and formidable, bobbing gently in the turquoise water. But when you look past the ship across the bay, you see the arid hills of Cuba. You see the watchtowers and the long, tense fence line that separates this tiny pocket of American territory from the hostile nation that surrounds it. The air is thick with tension. This isn't a peaceful port of call. It's a military outpost on the front line of the Cold War. It is in this volatile setting that the Joint Chiefs proposed their opening act of deception. The plan, as laid out in the document, is brutally simple. A U.S. naval ship would be destroyed in the harbor. The memo states, quote, "We could blow up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba." It goes on to suggest that the attack could be timed with the arrival of Cuban planes or ships in the area to provide additional evidence, or they could paint a captured Cuban MiG to look like one of Castro's and have it fly over the base, dropping fake bombs or making threatening passes. The centerpiece, however, would be the explosion, a sudden, catastrophic event. A fireball rising into the tropical sky, the sound of tearing metal echoing across the water. This act of destruction is the well-established core of the proposal. But the plan didn't end with the explosion. The document details the crucial second act, the creation of a narrative. They would immediately launch a dramatic air and sea rescue operation covered by U.S. fighter jets. The media would be filled with heroic images of sailors pulling their comrades from the burning water. Most importantly, casualty lists, the names of the dead and wounded, would be published in newspapers across America. The plan explicitly notes that public funerals for the victims would be a powerful tool to galvanize public opinion. It was a strategy designed to create an undeniable emotional truth that would overwhelm any inconvenient factual questions. To truly grasp the cynicism at work here, you must look back to the event they were so eager to emulate. It's February 15, 1898. The American battleship USS Maine is floating at anchor in Havana Harbor. A fragile peace exists between the United States and Spain over the issue of Cuban independence. Suddenly, a massive explosion rips through the forward part of the ship, which sinks almost immediately, taking 206 American sailors to their deaths. In the United States, newspaper magnates like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, locked in a fierce circulation war, seize the story. Their headlines scream of Spanish treachery, of a cowardly underwater mine. With no definitive evidence, they declare Spain guilty. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain becomes the rallying cry. Within weeks, the overwhelming public and political pressure pushes the United States into the Spanish-American War. The Joint Chiefs in 1962 knew this history intimately. They saw it not as a cautionary tale about media hysteria and jingoism, but as a successful, replicable formula for initiating a desired war. And this is where you uncover a lesser-known, profoundly disturbing detail in their planning. The Northwoods document reveals a cold debate about the nature of the victims. One option was to use a real ship with a real crew on board. Another, more elaborate option was to use a remote-controlled drone ship, an empty vessel that would be destroyed. But even if they used an empty ship, they still needed martyrs. The memo discusses how to handle this. Quote, "The U.S. could follow up with an air-sea rescue operation covered by U.S. fighters to evacuate remaining members of the non-existent crew." You read that phrase again. Non-existent crew. They were prepared to invent a roster of dead sailors, to give names, ranks, and hometowns to men who never existed. They would then feed these names to the press, allowing the entire nation to mourn fictional heroes. Families across America would read the casualty lists, thanking God their son wasn't on that list, their hearts breaking for the families of the fallen, families that didn't actually exist. It is a level of psychological warfare directed at one's own population that is almost beyond comprehension. The Remember the Maine proposal was powerful precisely because it was not original. It was a cover song of a proven hit. It relied on the power of historical memory and the sacredness of American military life. By invoking the Maine, they were tapping into a deep well of national identity and righteous anger. The plan was a chilling testament to their belief that history is not just something to be studied, but a tool to be wielded, a template to be copied for modern ambitions. This deliberate echoing of the past raises a critical question that remains just as relevant today. When a government or a political movement invokes the memory of a past tragedy to justify a new conflict, at what point does it stop being a respectful remembrance and start being a calculated act of propaganda? And how can we, as citizens, learn to distinguish between a genuine call to action based on present facts and a manufactured echo of history, carefully engineered to manipulate our deepest emotions? If the Remember the Maine plot was a cynical echo of the past, designed to stir historical grievances, the next set of proposals in the Northwoods document represented a terrifying evolution. The planners in the Pentagon seemed to understand that to truly create an unstoppable wave of popular support for war, the threat couldn't remain confined to a distant military base. It couldn't be an abstract event happening to sailors in a faraway harbor. No, to truly seize the heart of the nation, the threat had to come home. It had to walk your streets, haunt your cities, and make you feel unsafe in your own country. You are no longer on a military pier under the Cuban sun. You find yourself now on a bustling, sun-drenched street in Miami, Florida. You can hear the sounds of traffic, the distant rhythm of a Latin song playing from an open window, the murmur of conversations in both English and Spanish. You see the vibrant colors of the Art Deco buildings, the palm trees swaying in the humid breeze. In 1962, this city is a focal point of the Cuban story in America. It is a city of refuge, filled with people who have fled Castro's regime, a community bound by loss, hope, and a burning desire to one day return to their homeland. It is a place of vibrant life, but also one of deep political tension. And it is this community, this city, that the Joint Chiefs of Staff designated as the stage for their next act of deception. The central, well-established fact of this part of the plan is laid out in the document under the heading of developing a communist Cuban terror campaign. The proposal was to fabricate a series of violent incidents and attribute them to Castro's agents operating secretly in the United States. The primary targets for these staged events were Miami, with its large Cuban exile population, other cities in Florida, and even the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. The memo is chillingly specific about what this terror campaign would entail. They suggested planting bombs in carefully chosen locations, timing the detonations to maximize fear but not necessarily casualties, although the risk was implicitly accepted. The goal was to create a sustained period of public panic. The plan was designed to achieve a crucial psychological shift. At the time, the Cuban exile community was largely seen by Americans as a sympathetic group of freedom-loving victims. The Northwoods planners wanted to poison this perception. By staging a terror campaign and blaming it on Cuban agents, they would sow seeds of doubt and fear. Are there communists hiding within the refugee community? Can we trust these people? Suddenly, the Cuban problem wouldn't be a foreign policy issue about an island 90 miles away. It would become a domestic security crisis. The enemy would be perceived as being inside the gates, threatening American lives on American soil. The call to invade Cuba would no longer sound like an act of aggression, but a necessary act of national self-defense. As you delve deeper into the mechanics of this proposed terror campaign, you uncover a lesser-known detail of breathtaking cruelty. The plan was not just to plant fake bombs and blame them on phantom agents. The architects of Northwoods were willing to inflict violence upon the very people who had fled to America seeking safety. The document suggests they could, quote, foment attempts on lives of Cuban refugees in the United States even to the extent of wounding. Read that again. Even to the extent of wounding. You must pause to contemplate the sheer cold-blooded evil of that phrase. These were U.S. military leaders proposing to secretly orchestrate attacks on innocent refugees, people under American protection, and to actually shoot and injure them. They were planning to take people who had lost their homes, and in some cases their families, to a totalitarian regime and then victimize them again, all for a propaganda advantage. The wounded refugee shown on the nightly news would be the perfect symbol of Castro's supposed brutality reaching onto American shores. It would be a lie, purchased with the real pain and blood of an innocent person. The document also suggests they could stage the discovery and diffusing of dude bombs, ensuring a constant stream of news alerts, keeping the population on a knife's edge of fear. They would orchestrate the arrest of Cuban agents, who would then offer up confessions, further cementing the false narrative. This wasn't just a plan for a single attack. It was a strategy for psychological warfare against the American people. They were going to create a phantom menace and then use the ensuing panic as political capital. The bombings, the wounded refugees, the fake arrests, it was all part of a carefully managed theatrical production of terror. Each news report, each headline, each frightened conversation around the dinner table would be another victory for the planners, pushing the country one step closer to the war they so desperately wanted. They were willing to turn a city of refuge into a landscape of fear, and to sacrifice the bodies of the vulnerable to achieve their goal. This calculated plan to turn a population against a specific, visible community by manufacturing a threat raises a deeply uncomfortable question that echoes through the decades. How vulnerable are our societies to fear-based narratives, especially when a threat is portrayed as being internal, hidden within our own communities? And when a convenient enemy is presented to us in the wake of a tragedy, what is the duty of the citizens and of the press? To question the official story, to resist the simple satisfying narrative, and to ask who truly benefits from the climate of fear. The plans to terrorize the streets of Miami were designed to create a slow, simmering burn of fear, a rising tide of anxiety that would gradually turn the public against Cuba. But the architects of Operation Northwoods knew that sometimes a slow burn isn't enough. To truly shock a nation into action, you need a single spectacular event. You need a flashpoint. An incident so outrageous, so tragic, and so emotionally devastating that it galvanizes the country overnight, unifying it in a singular cry for vengeance. For this, the planners turned their eyes from the streets on the ground to the open skies above. You find yourself in a different setting now. You're in the polished, bustling terminal of a major American airport in the early 1960s. This is the heart of the so-called golden age of air travel. There's a sense of glamour and excitement in the air. Passengers are dressed in their finest clothes. The aircraft waiting on the tarmac are sleek, silver symbols of technological progress and American ingenuity. Flying is still a marvel, a symbol of a boundless future. It is within this atmosphere of optimism and perceived safety that the Joint Chiefs of Staff plan to stage their most elaborate and diabolical deception. The proposal, which you now examine in a detailed appendix of the Northwoods memo, is a masterpiece of cold-blooded logistics. It is a well-established, documented plan to fake the hijacking and destruction of a civilian American airliner and to lay the blame squarely at Fidel Castro's feet. The scheme is laid out with the precision of a military operation, a chilling step-by-step guide to manufacturing a casus belli out of thin air. First, you would need a plane. The document suggests chartering a civilian airliner from a company that is secretly a CIA proprietary, a front organization that gives the entire operation a veneer of legitimacy. Next, you need passengers. The plan calls for a passenger list composed of college students, a detail chosen with malicious care. These young men and women on their way to a vacation in South America would represent the nation's future, its best and brightest. Their names and faces would be published. They would be, in the document's own words, briefed on their roles, unwitting actors in a play they do not understand. The flight would take off as scheduled, a normal departure on a routine flight plan. The students perhaps are excited, laughing and talking, completely unaware of the script they are a part of. But once the plane is over the ocean, out of sight of land, the deception begins. The real aircraft, carrying the students, would descend to a minimum, radar-evading altitude. It would then deviate from its course and fly to a secure secret location. The document specifically names Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. There, the students would be quietly disembarked. At the exact moment the real plane disappears from radar, a second aircraft would appear in its place. This is the linchpin of the entire hoax. An identical plane, likely a modified military jet or a pre-existing drone, painted in the same livery, meticulously prepared to be an exact duplicate of the civilian airliner. This drone, remotely controlled, would seamlessly take the place of the original plane on its designated flight path. To any air traffic controller, it would appear as if nothing had happened. But now the stage is set. As the drone flies over the waters near Cuba, the final act begins. An anonymous pilot, sitting in a control room hundreds of miles away, would switch on the drone's radio transmitter. The frequency would crackle to life with a frantic Mayday call. The pilot would broadcast a message of being under attack, describing Cuban MiG fighters firing upon the unarmed civilian plane. And then, at the climax of the drama, the pilot in the control room would press a button, sending a signal to the drone. A pre-planted explosive device would detonate, and the duplicate aircraft would be blown out of the sky, its flaming wreckage scattering across the surface of the Caribbean. The world would be told that an American plane, filled with innocent college students, had just been brutally shot down by the Cuban Air Force. This brings you to a lesser-known and profoundly sinister detail that elevates the plan from a mere physical deception to a full-blown psychological operation. The planners weren't just going to destroy a drone, they were going to produce all the supporting evidence needed to make the lie irrefutable. The document suggests that after the attack, U.S. search and rescue teams would be scrambled. They would, of course, find no survivors, but they might find pieces of wreckage, carefully prepared and planted beforehand. More disturbingly, the plan implies the creation of fake evidence to be fed directly to the media and international investigators. Imagine the possibilities. A fabricated cockpit voice recording complete with the heroic last words of a non-existent pilot and the sounds of the attack. They could even produce a doctored radio transmission of a supposed Cuban pilot boasting of the kill. They were planning to pre-produce every soundbite, every heartbreaking image, every shred of proof necessary to sell this atrocity to a grieving and enraged public. The choice of college students as the victims was no accident. It was a calculated appeal to the deepest parental and protective instincts of the nation. An attack on a warship could be debated by strategists. A bombing in Miami could get tangled in complex local politics. But the unprovoked slaughter of the nation's youth on their way to vacation? That was an act so heinous, so unforgivable, that it would demand a swift and overwhelming response. It was a pretext designed to be politically unstoppable. This intricate, high-tech hoax blending advanced technology with pure emotional manipulation forces you to confront a truly modern question. In an age where seeing is believing, what happens when the evidence itself, the wreckage, the audio recordings, the official reports, is meticulously fabricated as part of the deception? If the very instruments of truth can be turned into tools of a lie, how can a citizen ever be truly certain of what is real, especially in the chaotic aftermath of a national crisis? That deeply unsettling question of how one can ever truly trust what they see in a crisis hangs in the air. This willingness to fabricate an entire reality, complete with fake evidence and manufactured tragedy, wasn't born in a vacuum. The Northwoods Memorandum, for all its unique horror, was not some rogue document, an island of insanity in an otherwise calm sea of policy. You realize it was something far more dangerous. The potential military climax to a secret war that was already being waged every single day in the shadows. To understand Northwoods, you must first understand the clandestine world from which it emerged, a world of dirty tricks, sabotage, and psychological manipulation known by another, almost playful codename, Operation Mongoose. You must now step out of the realm of theoretical plans and into the operational reality of 1962. You are no longer just a reader of a document. You are immersed in the secret heart of the American war against Fidel Castro. Operation Mongoose, or the Cuban Project as it was officially known, was a massive top-secret program authorized by President Kennedy himself in late 1961. Its one and only goal was the overthrow of the Castro regime. This wasn't a small-scale spy game. At its peak, it was one of the largest covert operations in CIA history. It was run out of a sprawling CIA station in Miami, codenamed JM Wave, which became the busiest spy hub in the world, employing hundreds of CIA case officers and thousands of Cuban exile agents. Its budget was enormous, its authority vast, and its mandate was simple: get rid of Castro by any means necessary. The existence and the broad strokes of Operation Mongoose are a well-established historical fact, confirmed by declassified documents and the findings of the 1975 Church Committee, a congressional investigation into abuses by U.S. intelligence agencies. The operation was a relentless campaign on multiple fronts. There was economic warfare. CIA-backed teams of exiles would conduct raids on the Cuban coast, blowing up sugar mills, mining harbors, and setting fire to tobacco fields, all to cripple the Cuban economy. There was psychological warfare. The CIA operated powerful radio stations that broadcast anti-Castro propaganda into Cuba, while its agents spread disinformation and rumors on the island to sow discord and panic. And then there were the direct paramilitary and assassination plots. Mongoose was the umbrella under which the CIA's infamous and sometimes cartoonish plots to kill Fidel Castro were conceived. You've likely heard of some of them: the exploding cigar, the poisoned wetsuit, the seashell rigged with explosives. While these plots ultimately failed, they demonstrate a desperate and obsessive desire to eliminate the Cuban leader personally. This was the context in which Northwoods was born. The United States was already, by any reasonable definition, engaged in a campaign of state-sponsored terrorism and sabotage against the Cuban nation. The Northwoods memo was not a separate, competing idea from the Pentagon. You discover it was designed to be the ultimate trump card for Operation Mongoose. The document was officially submitted to the Caribbean Survey Group, which was the Department of Defense's liaison to the Mongoose Task Force. The military generals, you see, were growing impatient. They saw the CIA's campaign of 1,000 cuts, sabotage, propaganda, raids, as failing to produce the desired result, which was a popular uprising against Castro. The Cuban people were not rising up. So the Joint Chiefs proposed a different path. If a spontaneous uprising could not be generated from within Cuba, then an overwhelming justification for an invasion had to be generated from within the United States. Operation Northwoods was the military's answer to the failure of Operation Mongoose. It was the break glass in case of emergency plan to achieve Mongoose's final objective: a full-scale U.S. military invasion. This deep dive into the bizarre world of Mongoose uncovers a lesser-known detail that perfectly captures the strange, almost surreal nature of this shadow war. It was a psychological warfare plan codenamed Operation Bounty. The idea was to print millions of leaflets and airdrop them all over Cuba. These leaflets would announce that the United States was offering huge cash rewards for the delivery of Cuban officials. The pay scale was graded: perhaps $5,000 for a low-level informant, up to $100,000 for a high-ranking government minister. And at the bottom of the list, as a final macabre insult, the bounty for Fidel Castro himself was reportedly set at a mere 2 cents. This was not just about incentivizing betrayal. It was about psychological demoralization, about branding the entire Cuban government as a collection of wanted criminals. This wanted poster approach reveals a mindset obsessed not just with defeating the enemy, but with theatrically humiliating them. It is in this context of bizarre, inflammatory, and deceptive psychological operations that the grand, deadly theater of Operation Northwoods starts to make a kind of horrifying sense. If you are already engaged in a secret war where contaminating sugar broadcasting lies and putting a 2-cent bounty on a head of state are considered legitimate tools of statecraft, the line of what is acceptable has already been moved dramatically. The moral framework has been warped. The men orchestrating these schemes were living in a world of shadows and deception, a world where the normal rules of conduct did not apply. This leads you to a fundamental and deeply troubling question about the nature of such secret conflicts. When a nation commits itself to a covert war of sabotage, propaganda, and assassination plots. Where exactly does the moral line between intelligence operations and state-sponsored terrorism truly lie? And perhaps more importantly, does engaging in such a shadow war inevitably corrupt the mindset of the planners, making even more extreme deceptions like turning on one's own people seem like a logical and justifiable next step on a very slippery slope? That slippery slope of deception, born in the secret world of covert operations, doesn't end in the clandestine meeting rooms of the CIA or the secure briefing chambers of the Pentagon. You realize that the entire machinery of Mongoose, the elaborate cruelty of the Northwoods proposals, was engineered to travel down a path leading to a very specific destination. Your living room, your daily newspaper, your mind. The ultimate target of Operation Northwoods was not Fidel Castro's government in Havana. The target audience was the American people. The target was you. You must now shift your perspective from that of an investigator discovering a secret plan to that of the intended consumer of the lie. Imagine yourself as an ordinary American citizen in 1962. You are raising a family, going to work, and your understanding of the world is shaped by the evening news on your black and white television and the headlines you read over your morning coffee. The men who drafted Operation Northwoods knew you intimately. They knew what you cared about, what you feared, and what would make you angry. They weren't just military strategists. They were acting as the most cynical marketing executives imaginable. The product they were selling was war, and they had conducted extensive, albeit informal, market research on how to create customer demand. The central, well-established fact of this marketing campaign is found in the document's own explicit statement of purpose. The memo declares that the goal of these staged events is to provide undeniable justification for U.S. military intervention in Cuba. It doesn't stop there. It goes on to state that the pretexts should be designed to create a healthy wave of national indignation, which would then place the United States in the apparent position of suffering defensible grievances. This is the language of public relations and emotional manipulation. They weren't trying to build a logical, fact-based case for war. They were trying to manufacture an overwhelming, irresistible emotional imperative. They needed to make the American people feel victimized, enraged, and righteous. Each of the major pretexts we've discussed was a carefully crafted advertisement targeted to a specific emotional demographic. Remember, the main incident was aimed squarely at traditional patriotism. It was designed to trigger a sense of violated national honor and to appeal to the sacredness of the American military. The imagery of a sunken warship and martyred sailors was a time-tested way to make a conflict feel like a noble duty. The terror campaign on the streets of Miami was a different kind of ad, one that sold fear for the homeland. This wasn't about honor, it was about safety. By making the threat feel domestic and personal, they could reframe an invasion of Cuba not as an act of foreign aggression, but as a necessary police action to protect American families. And the hijacking hoax, the downing of the plane full of college students, was the emotional masterstroke. This ad wasn't selling honor or safety. It was selling pure, unadulterated rage. It was an attack on the nation's children, on its future, on its innocence. It was designed to bypass rational thought entirely and trigger a primal, protective fury that would demand immediate and devastating retribution. This brings you to a lesser-known but brilliant piece of strategic thinking within the plan. The planners weren't just trying to sell the war to the American public. They were simultaneously crafting a campaign to win over the international community, particularly key allies. You find a crucial detail in the appendix describing the faked airline hijacking. The document suggests that the chartered flight should not be heading to just any destination. Specifically, it recommends the flight be en route to a country like Venezuela, Jamaica, or Trinidad. You might initially overlook this detail, but its significance is enormous. Jamaica and Trinidad were, at that time, members of the British Commonwealth. The memo explicitly states that staging an attack on a flight heading to a Commonwealth nation would, quote, overtly enlist English-speaking sympathizers for our cause. This is a profoundly cynical and clever piece of psychological targeting. An attack on a plane flying from the U.S. to another Latin American country might be seen by the world as just another squabble in America's backyard. But by fabricating an attack on a flight path that connected the U.S. to the British Commonwealth, they were deliberately trying to pull Great Britain and its allies into the narrative. It would allow them to frame Castro's Cuba not just as a threat to America, but as a threat to the international order, an outlaw state attacking civilian travel between friendly Western nations. The international headlines would be different. The conversations at the United Nations would be different. They were engineering the event to ensure that when the United States launched its invasion, it would not be seen as a lone aggressor, but as the leader of a justified international response, with its key allies already emotionally and politically primed to offer their support. This global dimension reveals the true scope of the deception. The healthy wave of national indignation they wanted to create was just the first ripple. They hoped it would spread across the oceans, isolating Cuba and providing the diplomatic cover needed to wage their war without international condemnation. In the Great Cold War struggle for the moral high ground against the Soviet Union, this kind of perceived legitimacy was priceless. Every detail of these planned atrocities was reverse-engineered from a desired emotional and political outcome. They started with the headline they wanted, "Cuba murders innocent Americans," and worked backward, designing a real-world event that would produce it. This whole-cloth fabrication of reality, targeted at both domestic and international audiences, leads you to a fundamental question about the nature of public opinion itself. If a government believes its cause is righteous, does that ever grant it the moral authority to lie to its own people to build support for that cause? And when you feel that surge of anger or unity in response to a shocking world event, how can you ever be certain that your outrage is your own, and not the calculated result of a carefully constructed and expertly marketed narrative? If the plans we've explored so far were designed to manipulate the American public's anger and fear, the next proposal you uncover in the Northwoods document feels like it comes from a different, darker dimension of strategic thought. It sought to weaponize something else entirely, something more sacred in the national consciousness. It aimed to hijack not a plane, but the very embodiment of American pride and admiration. This plan was designed to take the single brightest symbol of American achievement in the Cold War, a figure of unimpeachable heroism, and twist his story into a pretext for bloodshed. The unwitting pawn in this almost surreal scheme was a man whose name was on the lips of every American in 1962. The astronaut, John Glenn. To understand the sheer, breathtaking audacity of this proposal, you have to transport yourself back to the zeitgeist of that moment. You must remember what the space race meant. It wasn't just about exploration or scientific curiosity. It was the ultimate high-stakes battlefield of the Cold War, a proxy war fought not with soldiers but with rockets and capsules. For years, the United States had been trailing the Soviet Union. The Soviets had launched Sputnik, the first satellite. They had put the first man, Yuri Gagarin, into orbit. America was losing, and the humiliation was a source of deep national anxiety. Then came the Mercury 7, a group of test pilots chosen to be the nation's first astronauts. They were the embodiment of courage, skill, and the right stuff. And among them, John Glenn was the icon. He was the all-American hero straight from central casting. A decorated Marine combat pilot, a man of faith, a devoted family man with a telegenic smile. On February 20th, 1962, just 3 weeks before the Northwoods memo was written, Glenn climbed into a tiny capsule named Friendship 7, perched atop a volatile Atlas rocket, and became the first American to orbit the Earth. His 5-hour flight was a national drama of incredible intensity. The entire country, the entire world held its breath. When he splashed down safely in the Atlantic, the explosion of relief and pride was immense. John Glenn wasn't just an astronaut, he was America's champion, the man who had finally caught the Russians. He was given a ticker tape parade in New York City that rivaled the one for Charles Lindbergh. It is against this backdrop of national adoration and triumph that you read the next section of the Northwoods document, and the words seem to defy belief. This is the well-established, documented fact of the proposal. The Joint Chiefs of Staff suggested manufacturing a pretext for war out of John Glenn's historic mission. The memo, written in the immediate afterglow of his flight, considers the propaganda value if the flight had failed. It suggests that if Glenn's capsule had been lost, the United States could have fabricated evidence to blame Cuba. The document states, quote, that they could provide irrevocable proof that the fault lies with the communists. How? by manufacturing technical evidence suggesting the Cubans have the electronic capability to interrupt U.S. communications with the spacecraft. You let that sink in. The highest leaders of the U.S. military were proposing to take a potential national tragedy, the death of America as greatest hero on the world's biggest stage, and use it as a trigger for war. They were willing to stand before the world in a moment of profound national grief and present a complete and utter lie, complete with falsified radio logs and doctored technical data, to frame another nation for the accident. The cynicism is almost bottomless. They were looking at a moment of pure human drama and scientific endeavor and seeing only a strategic opportunity. But this is where you unearth a lesser-known and even more disturbing implication. The document phrases the proposal in the past tense, if the flight had failed. It's easy to dismiss this as a retrospective what-if. But consider the timing. The memo was written on March 13th. Glenn's flight was still the biggest news story in the world. The proposal wasn't an academic exercise. It was an analysis of a recent, incredibly potent event. This leads to a chilling, speculative question. Was this an idea they came up with after the flight? Or was it a contingency they had in mind before Glenn ever lifted off? Were men in the Pentagon watching the Friendship 7 mission, not just with patriotic pride, but with a cold, strategic calculation, perhaps even a flicker of hope that a catastrophic failure could be twisted to their advantage? The truly sinister aspect, however, is what this proposal implies for the future. The space race was just getting started. There would be more Mercury flights, then Gemini, then Apollo. By proposing the creation of clear evidence of Cuban interference, the Joint Chiefs were establishing a template. They were suggesting that any future space mission, any future astronaut, could become the centerpiece of a similar false flag. A minor, non-fatal glitch on a future flight, a temporary communications blackout, a faulty sensor, could be amplified and blamed on Cuban electronic warfare. They wouldn't even need to kill an astronaut. They would only need to create the appearance of a hostile act, produce their prefabricated evidence, and leverage the fame and heroism of the astronauts to sell the lie. The astronaut, a symbol of peaceful exploration, would become an unwilling poster child for war. This plan represents the zenith of the planners' moral detachment. They were willing to co-opt a national hero, to corrupt a moment of pure unifying national achievement, and to pervert the optimistic dream of space exploration into an engine for conflict. It is an idea so profoundly cynical, it feels like a violation. This leads you to a question that cuts to the heart of our relationship with our own icons. What does it say about a particular worldview when national heroes and moments of collective triumph are seen not as sources of inspiration, but as strategic assets to be leveraged, manipulated, or even sacrificed for a political end? And in our modern, hyper-mediated world, are our heroes and symbols any less vulnerable to being co-opted for agendas they would never personally endorse? This chilling portfolio of deception, the sunken ship, the street-side terror, the hijacked airliner, the imperiled astronaut, was not destined to remain a theoretical exercise locked away in a Pentagon safe. It was a formal proposal, signed by the chairman and every member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest military authority in the nation. It was typed, collated, and stamped top secret, and on March 13, 1962, it was carried from the Pentagon across the Potomac River and delivered to the desk of the Secretary of Defense. The buck, however, would not stop there. The plan was too monumental, its implications too vast. You are now a fly on the wall in the most powerful room on the planet, about to witness a quiet, unrecorded confrontation that would determine the fate of this monstrous plan. You find yourself in the Oval Office at the White House. The room is bright, filled with the afternoon sun streaming through the tall, arched windows that look out onto the rose garden. You can almost smell the faint, pleasant scent of cigar smoke and old leather. You see the famous Resolute desk, cluttered but organized, covered in papers, books, and naval artifacts, a reflection of the man who sits behind it. And you see him, the young, charismatic President John F. Kennedy. He's leaning back in his famous rocking chair, a concession to his chronic back pain, but it gives him an air of restless energy, of a mind constantly in motion. Across from him sits his Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. If Kennedy is the picture of charismatic politics, McNamara is the embodiment of cool, data-driven analysis. With his slicked-back hair, rimless glasses, and precise, almost mechanical way of speaking, he is the former president of the Ford Motor Company, one of the whiz kids Kennedy brought to Washington to revolutionize government with logic and efficiency. He holds a thin file in his hands. It is the Northwoods Memorandum. This is the moment of truth, the pivotal, well-established fact of the story. On this day, the plan conceived by General Lemnitzer and his fellow chiefs was presented to the civilian leadership. While no verbatim transcript of this meeting exists, you can reconstruct the scene, feel the atmosphere shift in the room as McNamara begins to speak. You watch as he, the man of facts and figures, is forced to articulate the unthinkable proposals his top generals have just handed him. He is a loyal member of the administration, but he is also the man who must now explain to the President of the United States that his own military leaders are suggesting a plan to murder American citizens to justify a war. You hear him in your mind's ear, laying it out in his typically dispassionate tone, a tone that makes the content all the more jarring. He explains the "remember the main" proposal. He details the plan to stage a communist terror campaign in Miami. He describes the elaborate hoax involving the drone airliner and the college students. He may even mention the contingency for John Glenn's spaceflight. As he speaks, you watch the president's face. You see the initial attentiveness shift to confusion, then to disbelief, and finally, to a cold, quiet anger. This confrontation brings a lesser-known but crucial context to the foreground: the profound and growing mistrust between President Kennedy and his military command. The Bay of Pigs disaster, which had occurred less than a year earlier, was a fresh and bitter memory for Kennedy. He felt that the CIA and the Joint Chiefs had given him catastrophically bad advice, luring him into a humiliating failure. He had come to see his top generals, particularly men like the staunchly conservative Lemnitzer, not just as advisors, but as relics of a past generation, men with a dangerously simplistic sledgehammer approach to foreign policy. Lemnitzer, for his part, privately held the young president in contempt, viewing him as a soft, inexperienced politician who lacked the guts to confront communism. This wasn't just a policy disagreement in the Oval Office. It was a deep, personal, and cultural chasm. So when Kennedy hears these proposals, he isn't just hearing a bad idea. You realize he is hearing the ultimate confirmation of his deepest fears about his own military. He is seeing, in black and white, a rogue mindset, an obsession with Cuba so profound that it has led his generals to contemplate treason and mass murder. The document on his desk is not a policy option. It's an indictment. It is proof that the very men entrusted with the nation's defense are willing to turn their weapons on the nation itself. You see Kennedy shake his head, perhaps cutting McNamara off mid-sentence. His response is immediate and absolute. There is no debate, no discussion of the plan's merits or risks. The rejection is total. For the president, this is not a choice between two viable paths. It is a choice between sanity and madness, between democratic principle and military pathology. In that moment, the elaborate, cynical, and deadly world of Operation Northwoods collides with the authority of the commander-in-chief and shatters. The meeting is brief. McNamara is dismissed, the document now a toxic object, a piece of evidence of a Rubicon the military was willing to cross. The silence in the Oval Office after he leaves is heavy. This quiet, unrecorded moment, this stark rejection, represents a critical test of a bedrock democratic principle: civilian control over the military. But it leaves you with a deeply unsettling question. What does it say about the culture of a military institution when its highest-ranking, most respected leaders feel comfortable even conceiving of such a plan, let alone writing it down, signing it, and formally proposing it to their civilian superiors? And just how thin is the line that separates a military that provides legitimate options from one that attempts to force a president's hand by engineering its own reality? The plan is dead. In that quiet, sunlit Oval Office, with a shake of his head and a few terse words, President Kennedy killed it without hesitation. The document, so full of violent and intricate potential, was rendered inert, a relic of a path not taken. But the ghost of Operation Northwoods lingers in that room, and it forces you to look closer at the man who rejected it. Your focus shifts now from the planners to the single individual who stood between their dark vision and its execution. Why did he say no? Was this a simple, clear-cut case of moral courage, a president standing resolutely on principle against the monstrous advice of his generals? Or was the calculation more complex, a blend of ethics, cold-eyed politics, and a pragmatist's fear of a plan that was not just evil, but dangerously amateurishly flawed? You first examine the most straightforward and appealing narrative, that this was Kennedy's profile in courage moment. Here was a man who, despite the immense pressure of the Cold War and the fresh humiliation of the Bay of Pigs, possessed a fundamental moral line that could not be crossed. You can picture him, a veteran of the Second World War who had seen the brutal reality of combat up close, recoiling in genuine horror at the idea of deliberately sacrificing his own citizens. His administration may have authorized the dirty tricks of Operation Mongoose, but this was a different beast entirely. This was not sabotage against a foreign state. This was a plan to murder Americans. For Kennedy, the student of history and the author of a book on political courage, this proposal may have represented the ultimate betrayal of the social contract, a violation so profound that it required no debate. In this light, his rejection was an instinctual act of a decent man, a defense of the nation's soul against the dark calculus of his own military. The well-established fact is that the rejection was swift and official. The plan didn't just fade away, it was formally killed. Shortly after the meeting, Kennedy's trusted military aide, General Maxwell Taylor, sent a brief, ice-cold memorandum back to General Lemnitzer. It acknowledged receipt of the Northwoods paper and stated in no uncertain terms that the president did not believe such a course of action was warranted. There was no room for interpretation. It was a direct, top-down order to cease and desist. That memo is the official tombstone of Operation Northwoods, but it's a tombstone that says nothing of the cause of death. Was it a moral judgment or a practical one? This question forces you to consider the other side of the coin, the pragmatic, political calculation. You put yourself back in Kennedy's shoes, but this time, you see the world through the eyes of a shrewd politician, not just a moral philosopher. He is a president who has already been badly burned by the assurances of his military and intelligence agencies. The Bay of Pigs was supposed to be a can't-fail operation, and it devolved into a perfect failure. Now these same men are presenting him with a plan that is infinitely more complex and politically explosive. You can almost hear the alarm bells ringing in his head. What if something went wrong? What if a single detail leaked? The drone aircraft is discovered, a briefed student talks, an agent is captured and confesses. The result would be a political cataclysm that would make the Bay of Pigs look like a minor fender bender. It would be the end of his presidency, the destruction of America's moral credibility on the world stage, and the greatest propaganda victory in the history of the Soviet Union. To a pragmatist, Northwoods wasn't just immoral. It was an unacceptably stupid risk. And then there was the ultimate risk: nuclear war. An American invasion of Cuba, even one with a manufactured pretext, could have easily triggered a response from Castro's patron, the Soviet Union. Kennedy was a man who lived with the daily terrifying possibility of global thermonuclear annihilation. He might have viewed the Joint Chiefs plan as a reckless tripwire, a harebrained scheme that could plunge the world into a conflict that would kill hundreds of millions. This leads you to a lesser-known, more nuanced piece of the puzzle. Kennedy's own thinking on Cuba was beginning to evolve. While Operation Mongoose raged on in public and in secret, behind the scenes, Kennedy was growing weary of the brinksmanship. Historical records and accounts from aides suggest that in the period between the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis, he began cautiously exploring secret back-channel diplomatic communications with Castro. He was looking for an off-ramp, a way to de-escalate the crisis that his own government was so furiously fueling. This wasn't public policy, but it reveals a mindset at odds with the all-or-nothing aggression of Lemnitzer and the Joint Chiefs. His rejection of Northwoods, then, might not have been just a response to a single monstrous plan. It may have been a rejection of the entire aggressive philosophy behind it. a philosophy he was starting to believe was leading the world toward disaster. So you are left with two portraits of a president. One is the moral hero, defending American values. The other is the master pragmatist, defending his political future and avoiding a catastrophic risk. The truth, most likely, is not one or the other, but a complex fusion of both. The plan was likely as appalling to Kennedy the man as it was unacceptable to Kennedy the president. But this ambiguity leaves you with a final, challenging question about how we judge our leaders. When a leader makes a decision that history now deems to be righteous and correct, how important is it for us to understand their true motivations? Does it diminish an act of apparent courage if it was also driven by cold, political self-preservation? Or does that simply make it a more realistic and perhaps more human act of leadership? That complex presidential decision, born of a mixture of morality, pragmatism, and a deep-seated mistrust, was not made in a vacuum. Actions taken in the silent, wood-paneled rooms of immense power inevitably create ripples, and President Kennedy's firm rejection of Operation Northwoods was a boulder dropped into a still pond. The rejection was not just the end of a monstrous plan, it was the beginning of the end for the man who had so confidently championed it. Your attention now turns away from the White House and back across the river to the vast, imposing structure of the Pentagon. You focus once more on the stern four-star General Lyman Lemnitzer, as the cold, quiet fallout from his audacious proposal begins to settle around him. There is no record of a dramatic face-to-face confrontation, no shouting match or formal reprimand. That was not how this game was played. The consequences for General Lemnitzer would be delivered not with a bang, but with a quiet, almost imperceptible turning of the great, grinding wheels of bureaucracy and power. You witness the fallout not in what was said, but in what was left unsaid. Not in what was done, but in what was pointedly not done. The central unavoidable fact is this. In the summer of 1962, just a few months after he submitted the Northwoods Memorandum, General Lemnitzer's two-year term as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff came up for renewal. It was common practice, almost a default, for a chairman to serve two consecutive two-year terms. It was a sign of stability and continuity. But when Lemnitzer's term expired, President Kennedy quietly declined to reappoint him. The phone call offering him a second term never came. The pen that would have signed the order remained still. Instead, Kennedy announced his replacement, General Maxwell Taylor, the very man who had served as his personal military advisor and had delivered the terse rejection of Northwoods. The message, to anyone on the inside, was as clear and devastating as any public rebuke. But a man as powerful and decorated as Lemnitzer could not simply be fired. He had to be handled. And so he was given a new prestigious assignment. He was appointed Supreme Allied Commander, Europe, or SASUR, the top military commander of all NATO forces. On the surface, this was one of the most distinguished posts in the Western world. You can see how, to the public and the press, it looked like a promotion, a move to a position of immense international importance. But in the context of the Cold War's most immediate flashpoint, you recognize it for what it truly was: a gilded exile. Kennedy was moving his most hawkish and troublesome general off the immediate chessboard. By sending Lemnitzer to Europe, he was removing him from the day-to-day decision-making loop in Washington concerning Cuba and Latin America. Lemnitzer would no longer be the president's principal military advisor. He would no longer have a seat at the table during the tense, urgent meetings of the National Security Council, where the Cuban crisis was being managed. He had been effectively neutralized, his influence on the issue he cared about most surgically removed. The Northwoods memo, you surmise, was the final, unforgivable straw. It was the document that proved to Kennedy that Lemnitzer's judgment could not be trusted, that his obsession with Cuba had made him a liability the president could no longer afford to have at his side. This quiet sidelining leads you to a lesser-known and truly chilling historical detail, one that underscores the monumental importance of Kennedy's decision. Lemnitzer's term as chairman officially ended on September 30th, 1962. 2 weeks later, on October 14th, a U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba took photographs of Soviet technicians installing medium-range nuclear missile sites. The Cuban Missile Crisis had begun. For 13 days, the world stood on the absolute precipice of a full-scale thermonuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. You must pause and contemplate the significance of this timing. During the most dangerous moment in human history, the man in the chairman's seat, advising President Kennedy on military options, was the newly appointed, cautious, and loyal Maxwell Taylor. The man who was no longer in that chair was Lyman Lemnitzer, the general who had long advocated for a preemptive nuclear strike against the Soviet Union, and who, just 6 months prior, had tried to trick the president into a conventional war with Cuba. You are left to wonder, how might those 13 days have been different? What advice would Lemnitzer have given during the tense, secret negotiations of the XCOM? Would he have pushed for an immediate airstrike and invasion? The very thing he had been trying to provoke all along? We can never know for sure, but the removal of his aggressive, uncompromising voice from the president's ear, at that critical juncture, may well have been one of the most important and least celebrated decisions of the entire crisis. The quiet, professional demise of Lyman Lemnitzer's influence in Washington is a case study in the subtle exercise of power. There was no scandal, no public disgrace. He was simply moved, his access cut, his opinions rendered distant. This method of dealing with such a dangerous overreach raises a profound question about the nature of accountability. When a powerful official proposes a plan that is morally reprehensible but not, in the strictest sense, illegal, what does true accountability look like? Is a quiet professional sidelining, a promotion into irrelevance, a sufficient consequence for such a profound betrayal of public trust? Or does that quiet resolution simply allow a dangerous ideology to fester elsewhere, unexamined and unpunished, leaving the public completely unaware of the bullet they just dodged? The quiet, gilded exile of General Lyman Lemnitzer was the first burial. A man and his dangerous ideas were removed from the center of power. The second, and far more enduring burial, was that of the document itself. The bold, red, top-secret stamp on its cover was not just a classification. It was a lock on a tomb, a seal on a Pandora's box of horrifying possibilities. You now find yourself faced with one of the most perplexing questions in this entire story. Why? Why did a document of such explosive, world-altering importance, a document that proves the highest echelons of the U.S. military were willing to wage war on their own people, remain a ghost in the machine, a secret kept from the American public and from history itself for nearly 40 years? You must first understand that secrecy is the natural state of things in the world of national security. Governments classify documents by the millions. It is a routine, often necessary process to protect intelligence sources, military plans, and diplomatic negotiations. When Operation Northwoods was first drafted and rejected, its classification was not unusual. It was a high-level, sensitive military proposal. Of course it was secret. The real question is not why it was initially classified, but why it remained so deeply buried for so long, surviving administration after administration, decade after decade, as if it were a radioactive artifact too dangerous to even look at. The well-established fact of its resurrection is that we only know about Operation Northwoods today, thanks to a completely unrelated historical event, the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. In the early 1990s, public pressure fueled by Oliver Stone's controversial film JFK led to the passage of the John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act of 1992. This act established an independent body, the Assassination Records Review Board, ARRB, with the unprecedented power to declassify and release millions of pages of government documents that could be even tangentially related to the assassination. Because the Northwoods memo was a key document concerning the Kennedy administration's aggressive Cuba policy, a central element in many assassination theories, it was swept up in the ARRB's wide net. In 1997, after sitting in a vault for 35 years, the document was finally declassified and quietly released to the public. There was no press conference, no official announcement. It simply appeared, a textual time bomb silently uploaded to the National Archives. But this only explains the how of its release, not the why of its long burial. To understand that, you must enter the mindset of the institutions that kept the secret. The most obvious reason is profound, bottomless institutional shame. Imagine you are an official in the Pentagon in the 1970s. or the White House in the 1980s. You come across this document, you read it, your blood runs cold. What do? Releasing it would be catastrophic for the image of the U.S. military. It's a permanent, indelible stain. It proves that the very worst conspiracy theories about rogue elements within the government are not entirely baseless. It confirms a willingness to commit the ultimate act of treason, to protect the institution, to protect its reputation and its budget and its public standing. The impulse would be overwhelming. Put it back in the vault, turn the key, and walk away. This was not just about protecting an abstract institution. It was about protecting the reputations of the men involved. General Lemnitzer and the other members of the Joint Chiefs who signed the document went on to complete their distinguished careers. They were revered figures. To release this document while they were still living, or even while their legacies were still fresh, would have been an act of historical vandalism, tarnishing the names of men long considered heroes. This brings you to a lesser-known, more subtle theory about its disappearance. The long silence may not have been the result of an active, ongoing conspiracy to hide it. Instead, you can envision a conspiracy of unspoken agreement. After Kennedy's emphatic rejection, the Northwoods memo became a toxic object within the bureaucracy. It was a career-ending, politically radioactive third rail. No one was going to reference it in a future plan. No one was going to cite it as a precedent. It was an idea so profoundly bad that it was professionally untouchable. You can imagine a succession of colonels and generals and civil servants over the decades, coming across a reference to it in an archive, pulling the file, reading it with widening eyes, and then silently, carefully, putting it back. The secret was kept not by a cabal of old men in a smoky room, but by a long chain of individuals who each independently recognized its toxicity and made the rational decision to not be the one to bring it into the light. It was a secret kept by a shared sense of shame and a powerful instinct for self-preservation. Without the legal crowbar of the JFK Records Act, it is very likely that Operation Northwoods would remain classified to this day. It is a stark reminder that history is not just what happened, but what is remembered and what is allowed to be remembered. The secrets a government keeps are a reflection of what it fears. And for 40 years, the government feared this document more than almost any other. This long, deliberate suppression of the truth forces you to grapple with a question that lies at the very heart of the relationship between a government and its people. We accept that some secrets are necessary to protect national security, but who gets to decide when a secret is being kept to protect the nation from its enemies, versus when it is being kept to protect the government from the judgment of its own citizens? And is there a statute of limitations on national shame? A point at which a country is mature enough to confront the darkest proposals of its past, no matter how badly they might tarnish the heroic image it holds of itself? That very act of declassification, the JFK Records Act, provides the necessary bridge to the darkest, most volatile, and most speculative chapter of this story. The reason Operation Northwoods was unearthed from its 35-year slumber is because of its undeniable connection to the Kennedy administration's Cuba policy, a policy that lies at the very epicenter of countless theories about his death. You must now take a deliberate step away from the established facts of the document and its rejection, and venture into the murky, smoke-filled world of conspiracy. You must explore a question that has been asked in whispers, and then shouts, for more than half a century. Did President Kennedy's unequivocal rejection of Operation Northwoods and the entire aggressive worldview it represented ultimately sign his own death warrant? To be clear, you are now entering the realm of theory. But it is a theory that proponents argue is built on a solid foundation of motive, means, and opportunity. The central idea is this. By 1963, President Kennedy had made a powerful set of enemies, a coalition of military hardliners, rogue CIA operatives, and enraged anti-Castro Cuban exiles who had come to see him not as their commander-in-chief, but as a traitor to their cause and a direct threat to national security. His assassination, in this view, was not the act of a lone, disturbed individual, but a covert coup d'etat, an execution carried out by elements of his own government. The theorist's case begins with the Bay of Pigs. When Kennedy refused to provide U.S. air support for the CIA-backed invaders, he single-handedly doomed the mission. The Cuban exiles who survived and their CIA handlers never forgave him. They saw it as a profound betrayal. Then you place Operation Northwoods into this timeline. In March 1962, the military leadership presents Kennedy with their ultimate plan to get the war they believe is necessary. He doesn't just reject it. He rejects it with contempt and then proceeds to sideline its primary architect, General Lemnitzer. To these military hawks, this was the final, infuriating proof that Kennedy would never give them the war they wanted. He was not just hesitant. He was a permanent, immovable obstacle. 7 months later, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy confirms their worst fears. He stares down the barrel of nuclear war and chooses to de-escalate, making a deal with the Soviets that includes a formal pledge that the U.S. will not invade Cuba. To the hardliners, this was the ultimate act of appeasement, a cowardly surrender. Finally, in the summer of 1963, Kennedy signs the nuclear test ban treaty with the Soviet Union and gives a famous speech at American University calling for a strategy of peace and a relaxation of Cold War tensions. To a man like General Lemnitzer, who believed in preemptive nuclear war, this was tantamount to treason. The well-established fact in all of this is the existence of this deep, simmering animosity. It is not a theory that powerful figures in the military and intelligence communities despised President Kennedy and his policies. We have declassified documents, oral histories, and first-hand accounts that confirm this intense hostility. Air Force Chief of Staff General Curtis LeMay, for example, was openly contemptuous of Kennedy after the missile crisis, believing his handling of it was the greatest defeat in our history. The hatred was real, it was palpable, and it was white-hot. The fringe theory is not about the existence of this hatred, but about whether that hatred curdled into a plot to commit murder. And this is where Operation Northwoods becomes the Rosetta Stone for the conspiracy theorists. They argue that the document is Exhibit A, the ultimate proof of the mindset of the alleged plotters. You can find in its pages a lesser-known but crucial element for this theory, a blueprint for a state-sponsored assassination that could be blamed on a convenient scapegoat. The men who wrote Northwoods were demonstrably comfortable with the idea of killing innocent people to achieve a political goal. They were experts in creating false pretexts, in planting evidence, and in manufacturing a narrative to sell to the public. The theory, therefore, goes like this. A cabal of these powerful men, seeing Kennedy as a traitor who was about to give away the Cold War, decided to eliminate him. They used their operational expertise to plan the assassination in Dealey Plaza. And just as the Northwoods memo planned to blame its atrocities on Cuban agents, they found the perfect patsy, Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald was a former Marine who had defected to the Soviet Union and, upon his return, had become a vocal, pro-Castro activist in New Orleans and Dallas. He was a ready-made scapegoat, the perfect villain for a pre-written story. In this terrifying narrative, the assassination of the president was simply the final, most audacious false flag operation, executed by the very men whose earlier, similar plans he had rejected. Kennedy was, in effect, killed by the ghost of Northwoods. This is a dark and deeply disturbing path to walk down, one that challenges the entire official history of that tragic day in Dallas. It takes the documented facts of Kennedy's policies and the military's dissent and connects them in a causal chain that ends with 3 shots fired from a book depository. It is a powerful and coherent narrative, but it remains a narrative, not a proven fact. This forces you to confront a crucial question about the nature of historical inquiry itself. The public record clearly shows a deep and hostile rift between a president and powerful elements of his own government. At what point does a compelling collection of motives, capabilities, and damning circumstantial evidence cross the line from a plausible theory into something more? And on the other hand, how do we as critical thinkers protect ourselves from the temptation to connect historical dots in a way that creates a satisfying and dramatic story, but a story that may not in the end be the truth? Whether or not you accept that the dark mindset behind Northwoods led to the events in Dealey Plaza, the discovery of the document itself fundamentally and irrevocably changes the way you must look at history. Its declassification is a watershed moment. It provides a proven government-authored template for high-level deception aimed at the American people. You can no longer dismiss the concept of a false flags attack as the paranoid fantasy of a fringe theorist. You now possess the cold, hard proof that it was considered a viable, fully developed policy option inside the Pentagon. This knowledge acts as a lens, or perhaps a splinter of ice in your eye, forcing you to look back at other pivotal moments, other convenient triggers for war, and to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. Was Operation Northwoods truly a one-off, an anomaly of madness that was safely rejected and buried, or was it simply the one that we managed to catch on paper? This new lens of skepticism inevitably brings your gaze to a steamy, tropical body of water off the coast of Southeast Asia, just 2 years after Northwoods was rejected. You are now focused on the Gulf of Tonkin incident of August 1964. This is the event that served as the formal justification, the legal and political cornerstone, for the massive escalation of American involvement in the Vietnam War, a conflict that would ultimately claim the lives of over 58,000 Americans and millions of Vietnamese. You recall the official story as it was told to the American public by President Lyndon B. Johnson. On the night of August 4, 1964, North Vietnamese patrol boats launched a second unprovoked torpedo attack in 2 days against the U.S. destroyers USS Maddox and USS Turner Joy, which were on a peaceful routine patrol in international waters. This, Johnson told a shocked nation, was open aggression on the high seas. He used this attack to rush the Gulf of Tonkin resolution through Congress, which granted him the authority to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States. It was, for all intents and purposes, a blank check for a full-scale war. For decades, that was the story. But now you can apply the Northwoods lens. And what you find is that the official story is not just misleading, it is a lie. The well-established historical fact, now confirmed by a mountain of declassified documents, internal reports, and even the National Security Agency's own official historian, is that the second attack on August 4th almost certainly never happened. The enemy torpedo boats were, in all likelihood, phantom radar signals, misinterpreted sonar readings from the ship's own propellers, and the nervous actions of jumpy sailors in bad weather and dark, unfamiliar waters. The commander on the scene himself, Captain John Herrick, sent an urgent cable back to Washington hours after the supposed battle, urging caution and stating that a full review left the attack in serious doubt. But that part of the story was ignored. The Johnson administration, hungry for a pretext to escalate the war, presented the shaky, unconfirmed initial reports to Congress and the public as undeniable fact. You see the chilling echo of Operation Northwoods. The 1962 memo proposed manufacturing an attack on a U.S. ship to justify war with Cuba. Just 2 years later, a non-existent attack on U.S. ships was used to justify war with North Vietnam. Was this a deliberate, pre-planned deception in the spirit of Northwoods? Or did the political and military leaders simply seize upon a chaotic, ambiguous event and deliberately misrepresent it to achieve a predetermined goal? Either way, the mindset is the same. The truth is subordinate to the strategic objective. This leads you to a lesser-known but critically important detail that makes the official story even more disingenuous. The first attack on August 2nd, which actually did happen, was not unprovoked at all. The USS Maddox was not on a routine patrol. It was conducting an aggressive electronic espionage mission, codenamed a DeSoto Patrol, deep inside North Vietnam's claimed territorial waters. More importantly, its mission was directly coordinated with a secret campaign of covert raids against the North Vietnamese coast, being carried out by South Vietnamese commandos under U.S. guidance, known as Oplan 34A. On the night before the August 2nd incident, these commandos had attacked North Vietnamese shore installations. The Maddox was in the area to scoop up the electronic signals of the North Vietnamese response. When the North Vietnamese patrol boats came out to attack the Maddox, they were not committing an act of random aggression. They were responding to a U.S. warship that was directly assisting an ongoing military assault on their sovereign territory. This crucial context was completely and deliberately withheld from the American people. This suggests a more subtle, but equally sinister possibility. Perhaps the plan wasn't to invent an attack from whole cloth, as Northwoods proposed, but to provoke a real one. You send a warship into a sensitive area during a covert military operation, you get a response, and then you feign outrage at the unprovoked nature of that response. It's a more sophisticated form of deception, one that allows you to claim you are the victim while knowing you were the instigator. The Gulf of Tonkin incident is the most glaring example, but with this new Northwoods lens, you start to see echoes everywhere. You look back at the Remember the Maine incident in 1898, the very event Northwoods sought to emulate, and you wonder. You look at other controversial events in military history. The official story for so many conflicts begins with a clear, unambiguous act of enemy aggression that demands a response. But now you have to ask, once you know for a fact that a government is capable of authoring a document like Operation Northwoods, how should you approach the official justifications for the other convenient war-starting incidents in history? Does this knowledge demand a higher burden of proof before a nation accepts a story that will lead it into war? And what is the profound danger of that healthy skepticism tipping over into a reflexive, corrosive cynicism, where no official account can ever be trusted at all? That razor's edge between healthy skepticism and corrosive cynicism is a difficult, vertiginous place to stand. To keep your balance, you find you must shift your focus from the what to the who. You have examined the plan in all its chilling detail. You have seen its disturbing echoes throughout history. Now you must descend into the most unsettling territory of all, the landscape of the human mind. You must attempt to understand the psychology of the men who gathered in secure wood-paneled rooms and, in the calm, dispassionate language of a corporate memo, drafted a plan to betray and murder their own countrymen. What kind of mindset does it take to see your fellow citizens not as people to be protected, but as props in a grand, bloody theatrical production designed to start a war? You realize immediately that labeling these men as simply evil is too easy. It's a way of putting them in a box, of marking them as other, as fundamentally different from us. The truly terrifying exploration is to consider them as they were, intelligent, decorated, and highly respected professionals who believed they were acting in their nation's best interest. To understand how they reached this point, you must explore the powerful psychological forces that can warp human morality, especially within the confines of a rigid, hierarchical institution like the military. The first concept you encounter is groupthink. It's a phenomenon that occurs when a group of well-intentioned people make irrational or non-optimal decisions, spurred by the urge to conform or the belief that dissent is impossible. The early 1960s Pentagon was a perfect incubator for groupthink. You had a homogeneous group of senior military leaders, all men, all career officers, all veterans of major wars, and all steeped in a culture of intense existential anti-communism. In this echo chamber, the core assumption, that Castro's Cuba must be eliminated by any means necessary, was likely never even questioned. Dissent would have been seen as weakness, as being soft on communism. The group develops a sense of its own inherent morality and invulnerability, believing so deeply in the righteousness of its cause that it feels exempt from the normal rules of ethical behavior. This sense of righteous purpose allows for the second crucial psychological mechanism, dehumanization. We typically think of dehumanization as something directed at a foreign enemy, but for a plan like Northwoods to work, the planners must on some level dehumanize the victims. The American civilians who would die in the staged terror attacks, the sailors on the ship in Guantanamo Bay, the college students on the hijacked plane. They could not be seen as individuals, as people with families and hopes and dreams. You see this in the very language of the document. They are referred to as casualties. Their deaths are a tool for creating a healthy wave of national indignation. They are a non-existent crew. This clinical, bureaucratic language is a powerful tool for creating emotional distance. It transforms the act of murder into a problem of logistics. This brings you to a well-established and deeply disturbing piece of psychological evidence from the era itself. In 1961, just a year before Northwoods was drafted, a Yale psychologist named Stanley Milgram conducted his now famous experiment on obedience to authority. You are likely familiar with it. Ordinary citizens were instructed by a man in a lab coat, an authority figure, to deliver what they believed were increasingly powerful and painful electric shocks to another person in a different room. The shocking result was that the vast majority of participants, despite showing clear signs of distress, continued to administer the shocks all the way to the highest, most dangerous levels, simply because the authority figure told them to. The Milgram experiment is a stark, factual demonstration of how powerful the impulse to obey is within a hierarchical structure. Now apply that to the U.S. military, an organization where obedience to the chain of command is the most sacred and essential principle. The colonels and majors drafting the fine details of Northwoods were not necessarily moral monsters. They were perhaps simply obedient soldiers doing the job their four-star generals had ordered them to do. This is where you discover a lesser-known but incredibly useful psychological concept developed by the psychologist Albert Bandura: moral disengagement. This is the process through which an individual convinces themselves that their own ethical standards don't apply in a particular situation, allowing them to behave immorally without feeling guilt or self-censure. As you read Bandura's list of disengagement mechanisms, you realize Operation Northwoods is a perfect case study. You see moral justification. We are doing this to fight the greater evil of communism. You see euphemistic labeling, using sanitized words like pretexts and incidents instead of terrorism and murder. You see advantageous comparison. Sacrificing a few hundred Americans is a small price to pay to prevent a nuclear war or the fall of the free world. And you see displacement of responsibility. I'm just a planner. The civilian leadership makes the final call. Through these cognitive tricks, a monstrous act is reframed as a grim but necessary duty. The men who wrote Northwoods were not cackling villains in a movie. They were, in all likelihood, patriots who had so thoroughly convinced themselves of the righteousness of their cause that they had performed a kind of moral alchemy on themselves, transforming a horrific crime into a noble act. This realization is perhaps the most frightening of all, because it forces you to ask a question that hits uncomfortably close to home. Are the psychological mechanisms that allow for such cold-blooded planning, groupthink, obedience to authority, moral disengagement, truly unique to military generals in a Cold War pressure cooker? Or are these vulnerabilities latent within all of us, within all our organizations, just waiting for the right, terrifying combination of authority, ideology, and fear to be switched on? That terrifying activation of our deepest psychological vulnerabilities, our patriotism, our fear, our instinct to obey, cannot happen in a vacuum. It requires a powerful delivery system, a trusted messenger capable of piping a single, clear message into every living room in the nation. The architects of Operation Northwoods understood this with absolute clarity. You realize they weren't just drafting a military operation. They were writing a script complete with heroes, villains, and heart-wrenching tragedies for the most influential institution of their time, the American news media. You must now turn your attention to the crucial and likely unwitting role the press of the 1960s would have played in this grand and terrible deception. To do this, you have to imagine a world with a completely different information landscape. You find yourself in a typical American home in 1962. There is no internet, no 24-hour cable news, no social media. Information is not a relentless, chaotic flood. It is a slow, steady, and highly curated drip. Your news comes from one of two places: the morning newspaper delivered to your doorstep, or the half-hour national newscast on one of the three, and only three, television networks: CBS, NBC, or ABC. These institutions were the powerful gatekeepers of reality. If they didn't report it, for the vast majority of Americans, it simply didn't happen. And crucially, public trust in these institutions was sky-high. An anchorman like Walter Cronkite of CBS News was consistently ranked as the most trusted man in America. His calm, authoritative voice was the voice of truth itself. Furthermore, the relationship between the mainstream press and the government, particularly on issues of national security during the height of the Cold War, was far less adversarial than it is today. There was a prevailing sense of patriotic duty, a belief that in the great struggle against communism, the press and the government were fundamentally on the same team. The well-established historical proof of how this media environment would have functioned in a crisis is the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. When President Johnson went on national television to announce that U.S. ships had been the victim of unprovoked North Vietnamese aggression, the media reported his claims largely without question or skepticism. The front page of the New York Times read, U.S. planes attack North Vietnam bases. President orders limited retaliation. Editorials across the country overwhelmingly supported the president's call for a firm response. The nuanced, contradictory, and incomplete intelligence was completely absent from the public narrative. The media, acting as a powerful echo chamber for the White House, helped create the unified wave of public opinion that allowed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution to pass Congress with only 2 dissenting votes. Now you can superimpose the Northwoods scenarios onto this media landscape. Imagine the news bulletin interrupting your favorite television show. Walter Cronkite appears, his face grim. He announces that a chartered airliner carrying American college students is missing, presumed shot down by Cuban MiGs near the Florida coast. A few moments later, the White House press secretary holds an emergency briefing. The next morning, the president himself addresses a grieving, horrified nation. Military officials present the irrefutable proof. A piece of wreckage, a fabricated audio recording of the pilot's last words. The newspapers would run the names and high school photos of the victims on the front page. There would be no dissenting voices, no bloggers in another country analyzing flight data in real time, no Twitter feed from a Cuban official vehemently denying the attack. Within 24 hours, the official story would be the only story. It would be an emotional, undeniable reality for 99% of the population, and the public cry for war would be deafening. This reliance on an unsuspecting press leads you to a darker, more controversial and lesser-known aspect of this relationship. It was a shadowy CIA program codenamed Operation Mockingbird. While its full extent is still a matter of intense debate, investigations by the 1975 Church Committee did confirm as fact that the CIA had a deep and covert relationship with members of the American press. The agency had recruited journalists, some high-profile, to gather intelligence, and had also used its media contacts to plant stories and propaganda that served its interests. In the context of Northwoods, this raises a chilling possibility. The planners might not have had to rely solely on tricking the media. They may have had at their disposal witting or unwitting assets inside major newsrooms who could help shape the narrative, suppress skeptical questions within their own organizations, and ensure the official story was cemented as truth. The media, in this view, could have been transformed from an unwitting pawn into a managed accomplice. Now, contrast this with today's media environment. It is a fractured, chaotic, and deeply polarized landscape. Trust in the media is at a historic low. If such an incident happened today, the official government narrative would be instantly met with a tidal wave of skepticism, counter-narratives, and outright conspiracy theories from hundreds of different sources online. The story would be politicized within minutes, with different cable news networks spinning it to fit their preferred partisan narratives. The idea of a single, trusted voice like Walter Cronkite uniting the nation around one set of facts is simply unimaginable. This stark contrast between then and now forces a final complex question. In the 1960s, the primary danger was a monolithic, trusted, and therefore easily manipulated media that could be used to create a single, unified, but potentially false reality. Today, the danger often seems to be a shattered, chaotic media ecosystem, where there are a million competing realities and no shared sense of objective truth at all. Which of these two environments, you must wonder, is actually more vulnerable to a sophisticated, state-sponsored deception? And how do we, as modern citizens and consumers of information, navigate the treacherous path between blind, patriotic trust on one hand and a radical, corrosive disbelief on the other? That question, of whether a monolithic media or a fractured one is more dangerous, is a chilling one for our own time. But for a moment, you must leave it behind. Let us step fully out of our world, the world where a president said no and crossed the threshold into the shadow of a history that thankfully never came to pass. You must now engage in a work of speculative history, an act of imagination grounded in the terrifyingly detailed blueprint of the Northwoods memo. What if, in that sunlit Oval Office on March 13, 1962, President Kennedy had not been so certain? What if, worn down by the arguments of his generals, Haunted by the fear of looking weak or simply convinced by their grim logic, he had looked across his desk at Robert McNamara and given a different answer. What if he had said, "Do it"? The world changes in an instant. The gears of the secret state begin to turn. A few weeks later, you find yourself living through the manufactured tragedy. A news bulletin breaks into your evening programming. The voice of a trusted anchor, grave and shaken, announces that a chartered airliner, carrying a group of American college students on a goodwill trip to South America, has vanished from radar off the coast of Cuba. Then the horrifying details begin to drip out. A frantic partial Mayday call, a report of Cuban MiG fighters scrambling in the area. The president addresses the nation, his face a mask of sorrow and resolve. The next day, the headlines are stark and screaming. Cuba murders our children. The front pages of newspapers carry the high school yearbook photos of the smiling, bright-faced students. The nation is united, not in fear, but in a tidal wave of pure, righteous fury. There are no dissenting voices. There are no questions. There is only a singular, deafening cry for vengeance. Within 48 hours, the invasion begins. You see the images on your television. U.S. Marines storming the beaches east of Havana, paratroopers dropping from the sky, B-52 bombers flying from Florida begin to pound Cuban military installations. The war that the Joint Chiefs so desperately wanted is finally underway. The initial resistance from the Cuban army is fierce, but the planners in the Pentagon are confident. Their models predict a swift campaign, the collapse of the Castro regime within a week, and American soldiers being greeted as liberators in the streets of Havana. But this is where their plan, and your speculative history, collides with a terrifying and well-established fact that the planners themselves did not fully appreciate in the spring of 1962. At the very same time they were drafting Northwoods, the Soviet Union was initiating Operation Anadur, a massive, top-secret operation to arm Cuba and turn it into a strategic fortress. By the time of this hypothetical invasion, there were not just Cuban soldiers on the island. There were tens of thousands of elite regular Soviet combat troops. There were Soviet-piloted MiG fighters. There were Soviet technicians manning advanced surface-to-air missile batteries. An American invasion of Cuba would not have been a fight against a small developing nation. It would have been a direct, hot shooting war between the armed forces of the United States and the Soviet Union. Now your alternate history spirals into a nightmare, driven by a lesser-known and truly apocalyptic detail. Declassified Soviet-era documents and accounts from Russian generals have since revealed that, in addition to the famous strategic nuclear missiles that would trigger the Cuban Missile Crisis a few months later, the Soviets had also shipped dozens of tactical or battlefield nuclear weapons to Cuba. More chillingly, it is believed that during the height of the crisis, local Soviet commanders on the island were given pre-delegated authority to use these tactical nuclear weapons against an American invasion force at their own discretion, without a direct order from Moscow if their communications were cut. You can now envision the horrifying scene. The first wave of U.S. Marines is fighting its way inland from the beaches, taking heavy casualties from entrenched Soviet units. A Soviet field commander, his position about to be overrun, his communications to Moscow severed by American bombing, makes an unthinkable decision. He gives the order to fire a single short-range tactical nuclear missile at the American beachhead. A flash of light brighter than 1,000 suns erupts over the Cuban coast. A mushroom cloud rises into the tropical sky. An entire U.S. Marine battalion, thousands of young men, is vaporized in an instant. What happens next? What does the President of the United States do? Live on television after the Soviet Union has just used a nuclear weapon against American troops? The doctrine of the time was not flexible response. It was massive retaliation. The pressure from his generals, the very men who started this fire, would be unimaginable. They would demand a full nuclear response against the Soviet Union itself. The world would stand on the brink, a single, horrifying step away from a full-scale thermonuclear exchange that would kill hundreds of millions and plunge the planet into a nuclear winter. The men who wrote Northwoods saw their plan as a clever, controlled, and limited operation. But this speculative journey, grounded in the facts of the Soviet military presence, reveals the colossal hubris of their vision. Their neat little lie could have been the spark that ignited the entire world. This forces you to ask a terrifying question that applies to any act of state-sponsored deception. Is there ever truly such a thing as a controlled lie or a limited deception when the stakes are war and peace between nuclear-armed powers? And does the very act of choosing to build a war on a foundation of lies inevitably blind the deceivers to the full, catastrophic spectrum of unintended consequences their cleverness might unleash upon the entire world? You pull back from that terrifying alternate history, back from the brink of a nuclear war that never was, and you return to the quiet, stark reality of the document itself. It sits not in the Oval Office waiting for a signature, but in a declassified file folder, a silent testament to a rejected future. For decades it was a ghost, its story untold, its chilling contents known only to a handful of insiders. The reason you and I can even have this conversation, the reason this chilling piece of history did not remain buried forever under the weight of its own shame, is largely thanks to the relentless work of one tenacious and brilliant investigative author. You must now meet the man who finally found the ghost in the machine, James Bamford. You see him not as a spy or a government insider, but as the opposite. A dedicated outsider who has made it his life's work to peel back the layers of secrecy surrounding the most powerful and clandestine parts of the U.S. government. Bamford is, by trade, a journalist, an author, and a documentarian, but his true calling is that of a modern-day archaeologist, excavating the buried secrets of the national security state. He is widely considered the world's foremost expert on the massive and mysterious National Security Agency, or NSA. His career is a testament to a kind of journalism that is slow, patient, and deeply reliant not on anonymous leaks, but on the painstaking, often frustrating use of the law to force the government's hand. This brings you to the well-established fact at the heart of this chapter of the story. While Operation Northwoods was technically declassified in 1997 by the Assassination Records Review Board, it was just a single memo, a drop in an ocean of millions of pages of newly released documents. It sat there in the National Archives unnoticed. It was James Bamford, while researching his 2001 book, Body of Secrets, who stumbled upon it. You can imagine the moment of discovery. You are in his shoes, sitting in a sterile, silent reading room at the archives in Maryland. You're sifting through box after box of declassified documents, your eyes aching from the strain of reading endless pages of dry, bureaucratic text. Most of it is mundane. And then you see it. A cover sheet with a title that makes you pause. Justification for U.S. military intervention in Cuba. You start to read, and with each sentence, a growing sense of disbelief and horror washes over you. You are not reading a historical curiosity. You are reading a blueprint for treason. It was Bamford who understood the document's earth-shattering significance, who pieced together its context, and who presented it to the world. His work, and the work of all journalists who uncover such secrets, is only possible because of a legal framework designed to pry open the closed fist of government secrecy. The most powerful tool in this arsenal is the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, passed into law in 1967. This landmark legislation turned the principle of government secrecy on its head. It established that the public has a right to know what its government is doing, and it created a legal process for citizens and journalists to request and receive federal agency records. It is the crowbar that reporters like Bamford use to pry open the locked files of the past. In this specific case, it was the JFK Records Act that provided the initial, broad declassification, but it is the spirit of FOIA that animates the entire endeavor. This brings you to a lesser-known and deeply ironic detail about the public's discovery of Operation Northwoods. Bamford's book, Body of Secrets, was published on April 24, 2001. The revelations about Operation Northwoods were, by any measure, a monumental story. It was proof of a conspiracy so shocking it should have dominated the news cycle for months, sparking congressional hearings and a national debate about the limits of military power. It should have been one of the biggest stories of the year, but it wasn't. Because 5 months later, on September 11, 2001, a real horrific terrorist attack occurred on American soil. The 9/11 attacks instantly and completely consumed the nation's attention. The media, the public, and the government were all, understandably, focused on the immediate crisis, its aftermath, and the new war on terror. The Northwoods story, as stunning as it was almost completely eclipsed. It became a historical footnote at a time when the nation was reeling from a present-day tragedy. This accident of timing is a major reason why, even 2 decades later, this declassified plot is not more widely known. It was an earth-shattering revelation that landed with a muffled thud, its shockwaves absorbed by a much larger and more immediate cataclysm. The story of James Bamford and his discovery is a powerful reminder of the role of the independent investigator, the historian, the journalist who is willing to spend years in dusty archives in pursuit of the truth. They are the public's proxy, the ones who hold the government to the promise of transparency. But their struggle against the culture of secrecy is a constant cat-and-mouse game. This raises a crucial question about the very nature of that transparency. If government and military officials know that their most secret and controversial plans might, through laws like FOIA, eventually be exposed to the light of day, does that knowledge act as a deterrent, preventing them from even conceiving of such plans in the first place? Or does it simply encourage them to create even deeper, more impenetrable layers of secrecy, to classify their documents with more rigor, ensuring that their darkest ideas remain buried not just for decades, but forever? That deep, dark irony of timing, a declassified plot for a fake terror attack being overshadowed by a real one, helps to explain why the ghost of Operation Northwoods didn't immediately rattle the cages of power in Washington. The world was distracted, its attention focused on a new and terrifying present. But a story this explosive, a truth this disturbing, cannot be permanently eclipsed. As the years after 2001 went on, as James Bamford's discovery began to spread through the nascent pathways of the internet, into documentaries, books, and late-night radio shows, the story refused to stay buried. You find yourself waiting, then, for the inevitable official response. You anticipate a press conference from a stone-faced Pentagon spokesman, a formal statement from the White House, perhaps a call for a special congressional hearing to investigate how this could have ever happened. You wait for the moment when the U.S. government must finally turn and confront the reflection of its own dark past. But you wait in vain. That moment never really arrives. Instead of a reckoning, what you encounter is a profound and deliberate silence, a wall of official non-comment. No president, from the time of its declassification to the present day, has ever publicly addressed or condemned the plan. No Secretary of Defense has ever been forced to answer for it on a Sunday morning news show. No congressional committee has ever subpoenaed the records to investigate its origins. The official response to one of the most shocking documents in American history has been to pretend, for the most part, that it simply doesn't matter. When government officials or Pentagon historians are cornered and forced to comment, you witness the second phase of the strategy: downplay and dismiss. This is the well-established fact of the government's damage control. They cannot deny the document's existence. It is, after all, in the National Archives, so instead they deny its significance. You hear the same talking points repeated. It was just a draft. It was a piece of out-of-the-box brainstorming. It was the military doing its duty, providing a full spectrum of options from the mundane to the extreme. And above all, you hear the final conversation-ending line: it was immediately rejected. You must pause and deconstruct this official narrative, for it is a masterclass in misdirection. Was it just a draft? You look again at the document. It is a formal memorandum, signed by the chairman and every single member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It was officially submitted through the proper channels to the Secretary of Defense. This is a finished, approved, and delivered proposal, not a handful of notes scribbled on a napkin. Was it merely brainstorming? You recall the stunning level of operational detail, the schematics for swapping a drone aircraft, the plan to create fake casualty lists, the logistics of painting a captured MiG fighter. This is not idle speculation. It is detailed, operational planning. And finally, the ultimate defense. It was rejected. While true, this statement cleverly shifts the focus. It frames President Kennedy's rejection as the end of the story, implying the system worked. But the truly horrifying part of the Northwoods story is not that the system ultimately worked. It is how close it came to failing. The story is not that a president said no. It is that the entire uniformed leadership of the U.S. military said yes. This official silence in the United States stands in stark contrast to the reaction in a country just 90 miles to the south. This brings you to a lesser-known, but deeply significant consequence of the document's release: the reaction in Cuba. For 40 years, Fidel Castro and the Cuban government had relentlessly accused the United States of plotting what they called autoaggression, acts of self-aggression, or false flag attacks, that would be used to justify an invasion. For 40 years, the rest of the world, and certainly the American public, had dismissed this as the paranoid, self-serving propaganda of a tin-pot dictator. It was seen as a flimsy excuse to justify his own oppressive regime. And then, in 2001, James Bamford published his book. Suddenly, Castro had the proof. A declassified, top-secret document, signed by the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, outlining a plan to do exactly what he had been accusing them of doing all along. You can imagine the profound, bitter moment of vindication in Havana. The revelation of Operation Northwoods became a cornerstone of Cuban state media. It was presented to their people and to the world as the ultimate "I told you so." It was irrefutable evidence that the threat from the imperialist North was not just real, but diabolical and deceptive. The document retroactively validated 4 decades of their own government's propaganda, cementing a narrative of American treachery that persists to this day. Back in Washington, the silence remains the primary strategy. It is a calculated and, you have to admit, effective approach. To launch a formal investigation would be to give the story oxygen. It would lend it an official credibility it has been denied. By ignoring it, the government tacitly relegates Operation Northwoods to the realm of conspiracy theories, allowing a confused public to assume that if it were truly important, surely someone in power would be talking about it. This official shunning of the topic raises a crucial question about how powerful institutions deal with their own history. When confronted with undeniable proof of a past moral and ethical failure, which is the more damaging response in the long run? To ignore the skeleton in the closet and hope the public eventually forgets, or to confront it openly with all the messy, painful, and reputation-damaging consequences that a full accounting would entail? And what does a decades-long official silence on a plan like Northwoods implicitly communicate to the public about that institution's capacity for genuine self-reflection and true accountability? That profound official silence, that calculated refusal to account for a moment of institutional madness, is not a neutral act. It doesn't cause the story to simply fade away. It leaves a vacuum. And into that vacuum, you can feel something else rushing in to take its place. A deep, abiding, and corrosive mistrust. You begin to realize that the true lasting legacy of Operation Northwoods is not in the apocalyptic war it failed to start, but in the permanent structural damage it has helped inflict upon the fragile bond of trust between the American people and their own government. This isn't just a shocking historical document. It's an active poison in the well of civic life. Trust, you reflect, is the essential, invisible currency of a functioning democracy. It's the baseline assumption that allows a society to work. Trust that the elections are fair, that the courts are just, that the police are there to protect you, and most fundamentally, that the government is not actively trying to harm or deceive you for its own ends. When that currency is devalued, when that trust erodes, the entire democratic project begins to tremble. Operation Northwoods did not single-handedly cause the collapse of public trust in America, but it serves as one of the most powerful and undeniable pieces of evidence validating that collapse. To understand its impact, you must look at the data. This is a well-established fact, tracked for decades by institutions like the Pew Research Center. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, the era when Northwoods was conceived, public trust in the federal government was at a historical peak. Roughly 3/4 of Americans told pollsters they trusted the government in Washington to do what is right, just about always, or most of the time. Now you look at the same polls from the last decade. That number has plummeted. Today, fewer than 1 in 5 Americans typically express that same level of trust. The long downward slide began with the credibility gap of the Vietnam War and the lies of Watergate. But the subsequent declassification of documents like Northwoods has poured concrete on the rubble. It provides a historical anchor for our modern cynicism. For anyone who learns about it, the Northwoods memo often acts as what you might call a red pill moment. It's a point of no return. Before you know about it, you might believe the government can be incompetent or short-sighted or even corrupt in the traditional sense, but you likely don't believe that its leaders are capable of sitting in a room and coldly planning the mass murder of their own citizens for a political objective. After you know about Northwoods, that comforting innocence is gone forever. It fundamentally rewires your perception of what is possible. It reframes how you interpret every subsequent crisis, every official statement, every call to war. This is how the document has achieved its most potent and dangerous modern relevance. This brings you to a lesser-known but vital detail. Operation Northwoods has become a foundational, almost sacred text for the most influential conspiracy theory of the 21st century, the 9/11 truth movement. Proponents of the theory that the September 11th attacks were an inside job invariably point to the Northwoods memo as their Exhibit A. Their argument, you see, is chillingly simple. If you have declassified proof that the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff were willing to use remote-controlled drone aircraft stage a fake hijacking and create a false pretext for war by blaming it on a convenient enemy in 1962, then why is it so unbelievable that another group within the government might do something similar in 2001 to justify the war on terror? You must be clear. This is not to endorse that theory, but you have to recognize the sheer power of Northwoods as a piece of historical fuel. It allows a theory that would otherwise seem outlandish to be grounded in a documented precedent. It lends a veneer of plausibility to the deepest and darkest suspicions about government malevolence. The ghost of Lyman Lemnitzer's plan now haunts the national trauma of 9/11, forever poisoning the public's ability to achieve a shared consensus about what happened on that day. This reveals a painful paradox at the heart of government transparency. The declassification of the Northwoods memo was, on its face, a good thing, an act of openness that allowed the public to see a hidden truth. But the content of that truth is so toxic that its revelation has the effect of destroying trust rather than building it. Keeping the secret allowed suspicion to fester without proof. Revealing the secret provided the absolute proof that the most paranoid suspicions were, at one time, entirely justified. It's a democratic catch-22. And so you are left here, in our modern, low-trust world, trying to make sense of the wreckage. The story of Northwoods is no longer just about a plot against Cuba in 1962. It is about the lingering suspicion that it has cast over every major event since. This forces you to ask a difficult, forward-looking question. In a world where we possess concrete proof of our own government, its past willingness to deceive us on a monumental scale, how do we possibly move forward? How does a citizen strike the necessary balance between being a vigilant, skeptical watchdog and being an effective, engaged participant in a democratic system that requires at least some functional trust to operate? And if that trust is ever to be rebuilt, does the very first step require the government to finally, openly, and honestly account for the ghosts of its past, like the venomous ghost of Operation Northwoods? That question of how to rebuild trust is perhaps the most important one we are left with. In the spirit of intellectual honesty, you realize that finding a path forward requires you not only to confront the darkest interpretation of these events, but also to fairly and critically examine the most charitable one. For a moment, you must deliberately set aside your suspicion, holster your paranoia, and step into the skeptic's corner. You must seriously entertain the official and unofficial explanation for this document, that Operation Northwoods was never a real actionable plan. It was just an idea, a thought experiment, a brainstorming session that got a little carried away. From this perspective, you try to see the document not as a monstrous conspiracy, but as a mundane product of a military bureaucracy. The first point the skeptic would make is that it is the sworn duty of the military to create contingency plans for every imaginable scenario, no matter how remote or distasteful. Planners, in this view, are supposed to think the unthinkable, to explore every avenue, to present their civilian leaders with a full spectrum of options. The Northwoods memo, with its menu of different pretexts, is simply an example of this process. It was the Pentagon's job to ask, What if we needed to invade Cuba, and then to game out every possible way to create a justification? The skeptic would also point to the very language of the document. While it sounds shocking to a civilian ear, it is, they would argue, standard militarese. It is the detached, clinical language of strategic planning, designed to remove emotion from the equation and analyze a problem from a purely operational standpoint. And finally, the skeptic would offer their trump card, the ultimate proof that this was not a rogue plot. The system worked. This is the core argument, grounded in the well-established fact of the doctrine of civilian control of the military. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, as is their role, presented the options. The civilian leadership, Secretary McNamara and President Kennedy, reviewed those options and, as is their right and duty, immediately rejected the immoral and insane ones. The chain of command held. The constitutional safeguards functioned exactly as they were designed to. In this light, the story of Northwoods is not a horror story about a rogue military. It's a success story about American democracy. You let this argument settle. It is coherent, it is rational, and it is in a way comforting. It allows you to place the document in a neat box labeled "Rejected Bad Idea" and to feel secure that the proper checks and balances are in place. But now, your inquisitive nature returns, and you begin to pick at the threads of this comforting narrative. You start with the signatures. Brainstorming notes jotted on a whiteboard are one thing. A formal typed memorandum, individually signed and endorsed by every single member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is something else entirely. A signature implies approval, a recommendation. This was not a list of raw ideas. It was a unified proposal from the entire military leadership. Then you reconsider the level of detail. A brainstorming session might produce the line, "We could fake a hijacking." But the Northwoods memo details a plan to use a CIA proprietary airline, to swap a real plane with a remote-controlled drone at a specific Air Force base, and to target allies in the British Commonwealth to generate international support. This is not high-level theory, it is granular operational planning, and most importantly, the document was formally submitted for approval. It crossed the desk from the Pentagon to the civilian administration. This act transformed it from a private military thought exercise into a serious policy proposal. This is where you uncover a lesser-known detail that deals a significant blow to the "it was just brainstorming" or funds-line defense. Operation Northwoods was not a complete anomaly, a single bizarre idea that came out of nowhere. It was, you discover, the most extreme expression of a consistent and recurring pattern of thinking within the national security establishment of the era. You find, for instance, a declassified plan from the Eisenhower administration connected to the planning for the Bay of Pigs known as Operation Bingo. Its purpose was to stage a fake attack on the American base at Guantanamo, complete with CIA operatives disguised as Cuban soldiers, which would then be used as a pretext to launch a full-scale military intervention. Sound familiar? The existence of other similar plans to manufacture pretexts suggests that this was not a one-off brainstorming session. It was a strategic concept that was very much in the water, a tool that elements of the U.S. government considered a legitimate, if secret, part of their arsenal. The system-worked defense begins to feel thin. Yes, Kennedy rejected the plan, but that feels like a lucky break, a reliance on the moral compass of a single man rather than the inherent stability of the system itself. The system had already failed catastrophically by allowing such a document to be drafted, endorsed, and proposed by its entire military leadership. The sober, skeptical view starts to recede, and a more disturbing picture reemerges. This leads you to a final, piercing question that cuts to the very heart of the skeptic's defense. In the secret corridors of power, what is the meaningful difference between a brainstorming session and a conspiracy to commit mass murder? If a plan is written down in exhaustive detail, formally endorsed by the highest authorities, and officially submitted for approval, at what point does it cross the threshold from a theoretical option into a morally culpable act in and of itself, regardless of its eventual rejection? And does the fact that the system worked in the final hour truly absolve the planners of the profound ethical and moral responsibility for what they demonstrated they were willing, and indeed eager, to do? That fundamental question of moral culpability hangs heavy in the air. long after the skeptic's arguments have faded into silence. Once you have examined the document from every angle, explored the political and historical context, and dissected the justifications and excuses, you are left in a quiet, deeply unsettled space. The raw historical investigation is now largely complete, but you are not left with any comforting sense of resolution. Instead, you find yourself haunted by a series of profound, lingering, and perhaps unanswerable questions. Questions that the declassified pages can force you to ask but can never truly answer for you. The first and perhaps most obvious is the question of prevalence. Was Operation Northwoods a singular, terrifying anomaly? Was it a brief, collective moment of madness? A perfect storm of a hawkish general, a new president, and a volatile crisis that produced a uniquely monstrous idea? Or was it something far more terrifying? The only visible tip of a very large and very dark iceberg. You recall the evidence of a pattern of thinking, the earlier similar pretext plans like Operation Bingo. This forces you to wonder how many other documents, proposing other deceptions in other contexts, remain buried in government vaults, still protected by their top-secret stamps. Was this kind of thinking a bizarre exception, or was it, for a time, simply the unwritten rule? To ground this question, you only need to look at the well-established factual findings of the U.S. Senate's Church Committee in 1975. This landmark investigation publicly exposed, for the first time, a staggering history of illegal and immoral abuses by America's intelligence agencies during the very same Cold War era. The Committee's reports are a catalog of horrors, proven CIA plots to assassinate foreign leaders like Patrice Lumumba and Fidel Castro, the FBI's secret illegal campaign of surveillance and harassment against Martin Luther King Jr., the NSA's illegal spying on American citizens, and the CIA's covert use of journalists and media outlets for propaganda purposes. The Church Committee report is undeniable proof that the mindset revealed in Operation Northwoods, a mindset of lawlessness, of deception, and of a belief that the ends justify any means, was not confined to one memo in the Pentagon. It was an active and widespread pathology throughout the national security state. This leads you to the second great unanswered question, the question of accountability. You look again at the fate of General Lemnitzer. He and his fellow chiefs proposed a plan that constitutes a conspiracy to commit treason and mass murder. Their punishment? Lemnitzer was given one of the most prestigious commands in the Western world. The others completed their careers with full honors. No one was court-martialed. No one was publicly disgraced. No one was held to account. What message did this quiet, gentlemanly solution send to future military leaders? Does it suggest that there is no real penalty for even the most extreme overreach, as long as your final proposal is rejected? Does it create a system where there is no deterrent against conceiving of such plans, only against failing to get them approved? Now you drift into a more speculative and deeply disturbing line of questioning. You consider the possibility that the plan's influence did not die with Kennedy's rejection. The Northwoods memo was a detailed menu, a toolbox of tactics for state-sponsored deception. The overall dinner was refused, but did the individual recipes survive? This is the chilling theory, that while the Northwoods plan was vetoed, the Northwoods playbook may have secretly endured. Is it possible that in the years and decades that followed, in other crises and other conflicts, a planner in the Pentagon or the CIA, needing a solution, pulled a single tactic from that playbook, the idea of provoking an attack on a U.S. destroyer, and then lying about the context looks eerily similar to what happened in the Gulf of Tonkin 2 years later? Is it possible that other, smaller deceptions in our history were inspired by the menu of options so carefully laid out in 1962? The document was dead, but did its dark spirit live on? Finally, you are left with the question of your own reality. You only know this story by a historical accident, a law passed in the wake of a presidential assassination. If not for that, this proof, this undeniable evidence of your government's capacity for deception would still be a secret. It forces you to ask, what else don't we know? How much of the history you've been taught is a carefully curated narrative, its contours shaped not by what happened, but by which documents have been successfully kept from the light? And is this kind of thinking truly a relic of a bygone Cold War era? Or have the pressures of our modern age, with its forever wars, its drone strikes, and its vast surveillance powers, simply created a new, more technologically advanced incubator for the same old pathology? All these threads, all these uncertainties, weave themselves into one final, ultimate, unanswered question. It is the question that will remain with you long after you have finished listening. The declassified record proves beyond any doubt that a plan to wage a false war against the American people existed. The historical record shows with equal certainty that it was rejected by a president. But the true mystery is this. Was the mindset that created Operation Northwoods an aberration, a cancer that was identified and fully excised from the body politic in 1962? Or is it a dark, recurring impulse, a dormant virus that lies sleeping deep within the vast secret machinery of the state, just waiting for the next moment of profound fear and crisis to awaken once more? That final haunting question, whether the Northwoods mindset is a ghost of the past or a demon that still slumbers in the heart of the state, is one that cannot be answered with a comforting certainty. It is, however, the essential question that this entire journey has been leading toward. After sifting through the declassified pages, exploring the historical context, dissecting the psychological drivers, and imagining the terrifying alternate realities, you must now step back from the specific details and render a final verdict. Not a verdict on the men, long since past, but on the enduring and chilling meaning of their monstrous creation. What, in the end, is the ultimate lesson of Operation Northwoods? The verdict must begin with the core, undeniable truth, stripped of all speculation. In the spring of 1962, the entire uniformed leadership of the United States military conceived, detailed, endorsed, and formally proposed a plan to stage a series of violent, theatrical, and fraudulent attacks upon their own country, their own military, and their own people, with the sole and explicit purpose of deceiving the American public into demanding a war with Cuba. This is not a theory. It is not a rumor. It is a declassified historical fact. They were willing to blow up their own ships to orchestrate a campaign of terror in American cities and to fake the downing of a civilian airliner full of students. All of it, a cold, calculated means to a predetermined end. This horrifying fact, however, carries within it the first and most crucial lesson. The system, however flawed and strained, held. The firewall of civilian control over the military, a bedrock principle of American democracy, was the final line of defense, and in this case, it did not break. The plan was stopped at the desk of a president who, for reasons of morality or pragmatism or both, recognized it as a catastrophic betrayal of everything his office stood for. It is a stark reminder that in moments of extreme crisis, the character and judgment of the individuals in the highest seats of power are a safeguard of almost unimaginable importance. The second lesson flows from the first. We only know that the system worked in this instance because of the second great safeguard: transparency. The long, dark burial of the Northwoods memo is a testament to the power of secrecy, but its eventual unearthing is a testament to the even greater power of declassification and a free press. This brings you to a final, well-established fact that serves as a hopeful counterpoint to the story's darkness: the continued existence and utility of the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA. This is not a historical artifact. It is a living, breathing tool that is used every single day by journalists, historians, and ordinary citizens to hold the vast machinery of government to account. It is a constant legalistic battle, often frustrating and slow, but it represents the single most powerful weapon the public has against the shadow world of official secrecy. And here you find a final, lesser-known, and almost poetic detail about this struggle. The ultimate defeat of this grand, violent, top-secret conspiracy was not some dramatic counter-espionage operation. It was a quiet, almost mundane, bureaucratic process. A law was passed, an archival board was formed, a researcher filed a request, a document was found in a box, an author wrote a chapter in a book. The antidote to the dark rooms of the Pentagon was the quiet reading room of the National Archives. The counter-weapon to a signed conspiracy of powerful generals was the patient, diligent work of a single, informed citizen. In this you find the story's most empowering and vital lesson. The power to uncover is, in its own way, a check on the power to conspire. So the final verdict on Operation Northwoods is that it is not merely a shocking piece of history. It is a permanent and necessary cautionary tale. It is a baseline measurement, a dark watermark that shows the depths to which a government, convinced of its own righteousness and consumed by fear, can be willing to sink. It teaches you that the most dangerous threats to a free society can come not from a foreign adversary, but from within its own most powerful and trusted institutions. And it teaches you that vigilance is not the same as paranoia. Vigilance is the active, informed, and constant work of citizenship. It is the price, as has been said, of liberty. The story of Operation Northwoods has now been told. It has moved from a top-secret file in a locked cabinet to a declassified record in a public archive, and now into your own awareness. And so you are left with one last question, not for me, but for you. What will you do with this knowledge? How does it change the way you listen to official stories, the way you consume the news, and the way you understand your own role in holding power to account? And does the simple, quiet act of knowing this story, and perhaps telling it to others, become the ultimate safeguard? A small, but vital inoculation, spread from person to person against such a madness ever being allowed to fester in the dark again. Tonight, we pulled back the curtain on Operation Northwoods, a declassified plan that stands as a chilling testament to how far the architects of power are sometimes willing to go. We journeyed from the paranoid heights of the Cold War to the quiet Oval Office, where the plan was ultimately rejected. We saw how the Joint Chiefs of Staff were prepared to sacrifice American lives, staging terror attacks and faking tragedies, all to manufacture a pretext for a war with Cuba. We explored the psychology of the planners and the critical role of civilian oversight in preventing this nightmare from becoming a reality. The story of Northwoods is a stark reminder that a government's darkest secrets can be more terrifying than any foreign threat. It forces us to question the narratives we are given and to recognize the profound importance of transparency and a vigilant, informed citizenry. The most important question it leaves us with is whether the mindset that created it was an anomaly of the past, or a danger that we must always be on guard against. As fellow investigators of the unknown, your skepticism and your curiosity are the most essential tools we have. That's all for today. Stay curious, stay questioning, and I'll see you in the next file.